Good morning, everybody. Today's date is Wednesday, June 10th, 2020. I am your host, Tom Kaczynski, for episode 81 of Coronavirus Central. Whether you treat that as 9 squared or 3 to the 4th, we certainly have been going for quite a long time, and the story continues to evolve here. I really should call it CV Central, actually, because we've really gone beyond coronavirus to look at the whole curriculum vitae of a world gone mad. And as we go into today's episode, what the focal point for today is, we're going to shift to a much more international focus, and we're going to look at the situation in the security situation, specifically in the Pacific Rim. We're going to touch heavily on China, on India. We'll mention Pakistan, Korea, Japan, Australia, and Russia. And of course, the United States sits at the back of that because, as I often say at this show, we are now living in a time of pandemic at the intersection of the American Second Civil War and the Cold War that is shaping up to potentially be the Third World War. So there's a lot in that. I've made that argument many, many times, but let's go today into the evidence. We're going to leave America behind, although it goes without saying that watching Seattle develop an autonomous zone that looks like something straight out of the 1830 Paris communes that were attempted in July, or in May develop into something that looked like St. Petersburg 1917 can't go without total comment. Look for the assertion of direct authority in places, especially if they are urban centers that are more progressive, where they may decide to enact direct control around the existing government if the existing government doesn't let them get their way, and that's where things will get really interesting. I don't know that it will happen in Seattle, as Mayor Jenny, as she likes to go as, probably isn't the sort of person who's going to resist that and is going to allow this situation to go forward. But for those who are paying attention, what is being set up in Seattle right now looks a heck of a lot like Tahrir Square did in Cairo back a few years ago, as well as the Maidan in the Ukraine. So don't be surprised if we don't see something very interesting and strange happen in Seattle and or Minneapolis or other sites throughout North America and within the United States specifically. And these will probably have a destabilizing effect. Some of you have also noted, and it is something I intend to cover, I will not have a show probably on Friday because I have to travel for personal reasons, but I will be talking about, perhaps this weekend actually, I may do a rare weekend show. We're going to take a look at what is happening with respect to the case numbers starting to spike a little bit. I wanted to talk about it maybe tomorrow, but the problem is I don't think we'll really see it yet. But the Texas, Georgia, some other Arizona places, numbers are coming up, which fits what we would have expected with the reopen. So America didn't stop the virus. We just took a pause, and now we're going to continue with that, and we're going to see that this is going to be ongoing. And I think the idea at this point that people are going to go in for a second lockdown, the people on the left, not everyone, but it's certainly led by the protests, have made it impossible to go ahead back to another lockdown. And if you think people on the right are going to agree with that, given that they've seen the complete hypocrisy of how this has been handled, with respect to what has been asked, depending upon the issue at stake, that's not going to happen either. And the reality is, both sides are going to lose, and ultimately lack of trust, which I think at this point, frankly, is warranted between the sides, is the big thing that's going to drive that. So in the United States specifically, but also I would think in those other countries, and it's interesting that there are protests throughout Western Europe and through a lot of American allies. I think that's no accident. And as we go into today's episode, I want you to keep that in mind. What are these doing in the bigger picture as we look at China and we look at the well understood conflict that's evolving between China and the United States? Who are the allies, who are the adversaries, and who are acting in between? And as we look at that, I want to be very clear, this is a complicated story. In 1939, before World War II started, as late as 35, 36, 37, Italy was thought to be one of the allies. And Mussolini actually got along pretty well with the French and English governments, Lloyd George, and I think it was Clemenceau, if I remember right, who was there. And what ended up happening was that their actions in wanting to spread their empire into Africa, into Ethiopia specifically, were decried by the Allies. And of course, the way that worked out was that Italy saw their actions in Ethiopia as no different than what Britain had done through much of West Africa, or France had done in Ivory Coast or Mali, or any number of their own colonial possessions. So the hypocrisy of that threw them into the Axis of Iron, and that's where we got the term Axis from, where they signed up with Germany, and eventually Germany and Italy added Japan to the mix. Although it's interesting to note that Italy didn't actually declare war on France until Germany was rolling halfway through, just because they wanted to get a piece at the table, and that was a complicated relationship. But that's the way it is between nations. There are complicated relationships, and who's on what side and who works with whom. We now live in a low-trust world, and in a low-trust world, you have to look at the questions of what is actually happening out there. And so we're going to go ahead and look at that in an East Asian context today, primarily, as well as South Asian. And we're going to look at what has been happening on the ground while we've all been talking about other issues, because I think it's very important. And I think that it tells a different story that is very much related to what we've been talking about. And that is to ask what actors are out there, what interests are being served by different events, and then you can bring it back to the micro of whatever country you live in. And this will be a nice one for some of our international audience as well. I know we have a lot of people out there, and we'll see what we learn. So we'll look at the facts on the ground. And the second part of the monologue, I guess, that I wanted to include is the media lies to you. All the media lies to you. Every person lies. I probably lie to you. I'm not trying to, but it happens. I want you to get out of your head this idea that there are legitimate sources and illegitimate sources. Every one of these is owned by some corporation or some person. Yeah, if it's a corporation, their goal is to make money in service of a common interest or to serve the editors. If they're a small individual, they're probably doing this because they're passionate about some ideological reason. The idea of an objective press is the biggest load of crap that there's ever been, and you shouldn't believe that. And I'm not saying people don't have their biases. I put my biases up front. I admit them, and I have a long history in literature to go ahead and substantiate where my biases are, where if you want to take the time, you can figure out exactly where I fall on things. I'm not very secretive about it. But I mention all this because I'm trying to approach telling you the news from almost the perspective of an active historian. And just to give you a little background, as much as I'm not a medical professional, I am very much a history professional. I have an honors degree from Swarthmore College. I've written multiple books on history that have covered these things. And people sometimes say, well, why don't you cite a lot of sources? I'm like, because I'm not trying to tell you what everyone else is telling you. I'm telling you what I observe based on the facts on the ground that I see. And I provide a lot of sourcing here because it's helpful for how you need to understand the narrative. But here is how you understand what's happening, and this is so important, and this is what they used to teach in history. I was blessed, I graduated college in 2003, and we still had some old fossil professors there who actually believed in primary sources, about looking at the evidence and developing your narrative based upon what you actually see on the ground, rather than finding the facts to substantiate your narrative. And social history was taking over college when I was there. I can only imagine how bad it is now, where basically you're said, go find examples of how bad X or Y are. And that's what we have, and it was already starting when I was in college. But here, what we're going to do is we're going to do it differently. We're going to go ahead, we're going to look at facts and data points, and I will offer a narrative that fits how I think they connect together. But the good news is, as we go through this, you can connect the data points how you see best, and you will be armed with the facts and evidence of what people are doing. So you'll have facts on the ground, motives for who's acting, and the connections between actors. That is how you tell a story properly. And I will tell you, one of the big things you learn from the media when we talk about objectivity and lack of objectivity is that they don't lie by not telling you what they don't want you to hear. You hear about X but not Y. You hear about Group A hurting Group B, but you never hear about Group B hurting Group A. And what they do is they create a morality tale. They create a narrative that tells a very simplified version. The truth is, history is an untellable discipline, but if you're a good storyteller, you can grab some threads out of it and tell a story that follows through, that connects certain actors, and then we agree upon it. It's the lie commonly agreed upon that becomes our eventual truth. That is kind of where we're at in this story, where we are all fighting, as I said, I think it was like about a week ago now, that, we are fighting to tell this narrative. So let me tell you the narrative of what I'm seeing in Asia and how I see this as part of a larger global conflict that's going forward. And keep in mind as we go through this what the destabilization of America means for each of these actors and for your country. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? The new world is here. I told you when COVID came, the old world died. The early adopters are now getting out there, and not surprising. It's the radicals and the authoritarian state actors who came through it first, whereas a bunch of us are still stuck fighting over old world battles. You don't realize the old world is dead. COVID killed it. It killed the globally interconnected economy. Don't let the stock market go berserk fool you. Ultimately, that's sort of a shell game too. And if the stock market continues to go up, just remember a big part of it, why, is because every small business that's been shut down from either the protests and demonstrations or from COVID, they're not coming back. So what happened to all the competition was gone. So instead of playing Risk, we're also playing a little bit of Monopoly. But today it's going to be more fun to look at the map, and I haven't had a chance to paint some things in a while, and I love doing that, so we're going to do that today. Okay, so that's the show for today. Let's see what we end up with. I got about... Let's see, I might get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories lined up. I'm only going to read 9 of them at most. The one's really long. It's a tremendous story, but it's highly technical about geopolitics. I'm mentioning it for those who want deeper research. It's definitely worth the read, and it helped form some of my thoughts, but it really gets into detail about certain elements of this conflict that would be of more interest for those with a historical military mindset. Okay, so COVID-19info.live. Let's just look real fast what the numbers are before we go into this. And I'm going to pull out certain countries specifically just to talk about them today because they're going to be relevant to the narrative. 8:10 a.m. on 6/10, we are dealing with 7.389 million confirmed cases, just a hair short of 417,000 deaths at the moment, and 3.64 million recoveries. That's worldwide. America's at 2,045,000. That's a gain of 19,033, and that's a slight upward tick, and I expect that will continue. Deaths, 114,159. That's at 1,053. So countries I want to mention today. Russia is now in third place at 493,657. That's a gain of 8,404. Although I will mention Brazil is going up like crazy. They're gaining more cases per day now than the United States, gaining 31,197 to 742,84. I should say 742,084, sorry. And we have 38,497 deaths. So right now, Brazil is actually seeing a worse trajectory than the United States. We'll see if that holds. I suspect the U.S. will start speeding back up shortly. All right, and Russia has 6,358 deaths. India, 276,583 confirmed cases. That's a gain of 8,835. They will, by the end of the week, be in fourth place and rising quickly. And they have 7,750 deaths so far reported on this. We also are going to mention Pakistan, 113,702. They have 2,255. And China claims to have 83,046 with a gain of only 3 new cases. Whether you choose to believe that or not is up to you. Okay, and I want to see if Japan is anywhere on this list, how far down there, because we haven't said anything about Japan in forever. And originally, at the beginning of this, Japan is just trucking along, 17,210 cases, 1,739 deaths. So we'll see what happens with that. Japan's been a very low number. Okay, so let's start with what's been going on in the Koreas. And the conflict between North and South Korea has long been a proxy battle between the United States and China, going back to the actual Korean War, where it was Chinese troops pouring in across the Yalu River that prevented General MacArthur from fulfilling the UN mandate of reuniting Korea, with a lot of help from the Soviet Union, which was still active and well alive at that time. So, ultimately, it's been, for a very long time, we understand that North Korea has been a client state of the Chinese Communist Party, at least since the fall of the Soviet Union. And there is a tension there where, on the one hand, I'm sure that Kim Jong-un would theoretically love to get free of complete Chinese control, and that's why you've seen in the past few years a pivot to try to get a better relationship with the West. But on the other hand, he'll remember the case of Muammar Gaddafi, who began making friendly with the West and then was summarily replaced. So people don't trust the West, and they don't trust America, especially dictators. And I'm not saying that dictators necessarily should trust America, or that it's bad that that we don't get along with them. But what I am saying is if they don't trust you, they won't work with you beyond sort of a very utilitarian interest. So North Korea still remains probably and necessarily a little bit in the Chinese camp. And so this is what's interesting. North Korea told South Korea, because protest groups were pamphleting North Korea with flyers saying that, you should stand up against Kim, that this would be shut down, or that they were not going to talk to South Korea anymore. So we've come a very long way from where we were about a year ago, where the idea that we might eventually have a permanent peace treaty to replace the armistice after the Korean War, where really there's just been a ceasefire and shooting. The war never formally ended, okay, despite the fact that it hasn't been actively fought, or at least hasn't been completely hot in many, many years. So all that being prefaced to this, one thing that has been the case of the Kim dynasty in Korea throughout the whole of its existence is that you have only heard the head of state, whichever male member of the Kim family was in charge, be the one who makes threats at any given point. And that's why we have a very anomalous data point where we're going to talk about here, which is not only did North Korea cut off its connection speaking to South Korea, which is, the lifeline it tries to keep open to the world, beyond whatever it does with China, which is not publicly known, but that more importantly, it was his sister who did it. Now, some of you may recall or remember, if you were paying close attention, about a month or 2 months ago, Kim Jong-un disappeared for many weeks, and we were speculating, was he dead? Was he harmed in a missile test? Did something happen? And then pictures were put out where we've seen him since then, supposedly. But now that I see his sister out there doing the talking, and that I've read bits and pieces over the last couple months, I keep an eye on these things, that Chinese advisors are involved, I think we have to ask a question, which is who's running the show in Korea? Is it Kim Jong-un or is it his sister? Do we know the question? Kim Yo-jong is her name. Conversely, is she doing that as a proxy for China? And in any case, what does it mean that North Korea is acting in a more militant fashion again during the middle of all these standoffs? Is it China putting pressure on them? Is it them looking for a third way? Are they looking at opportunities? We don't know, but it's an interesting question, and it's an important one because if a North-South Korea conflict breaks out, even though it could be completely organic to issues in that relationship, it could ultimately bring in different allies in predictable ways that would go ahead and lead to war. If you've ever watched, it's an older movie, but for those of my age or older might appreciate, if you ever saw the old movie with Matthew Broderick, War Games, where at the end of it, Joshua, the supercomputer doing this, creates all these different scenarios to fight a thermonuclear war, you see different things are started in different ways, but ultimately they all end up the same way because the entangling web of relationships leads countries into conflict in predictable ways. And what we're going to try to do is pull on some of those threads and see what pings when we do so. We're going to start with this piece by the Washington Post. And this was written by Minju Kim and Simon Denier, I don't know how that's pronounced. It was written on the 9th, yesterday. Don't bother calling us, North Korea tells South as Kim's sister dials up threats. Seoul. North Korea said it would shut down telephone hotlines with South Korea on Tuesday and ultimately sever all communications with its neighbor, hardening its policy as it attempts to gain concessions from Seoul. The escalation came 5 days after Kim Yo-jong, younger sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, took charge of relations with South Korea and threatened to shut a joint liaison office and factory park in the border town of Kaesong. Kim Yo-jong, who has been taking an increasingly high-profile role in Pyongyang, and that's their capital, by the way, had demanded that Seoul prevent activists from sending leaflets across the border intended to promote democracy and undermine the nuclear-armed regime. In an attempt to salvage ties with the North, the South Korean government pledged to seek a legislative ban on the leaflets, angering human rights activists and others who questioned Seoul's commitment to freedom of expression. Pyongyang has hardened its rhetoric since nuclear talks with the United States broke down last year, and has repeatedly signaled its fury at South Korea for implementing United Nations sanctions and failing to restart North-South economic cooperation projects. But the latest escalation may represent an attempt by Kim Yo-jong to assert her authority in a new prominent position within the regime and an effort to exploit South Korea's desire for better relations with the North. And to be clear, most people in South Korea do not want a war with North Korea, not the least of which because Seoul sits within easy missile range of all the different ordnance that North Korea has on that border. It would literally be a destruction that would be of... I guess the best example would be the firebombing of Dresden in Germany, if you want to think of it, which was orders of magnitude worse than the Blitz in London, with which you may be more familiar. Anyway, the North's official Korean Central News Agency said a communication channel at the liaison office, a direct hotline between the country's leaders and military hotlines, would be closed as of noon Tuesday. This measure is the first step of the determination to completely shut down all contact means with South Korea, the report said. We have reached a conclusion that there is no need to sit face-to-face with the South Korean authorities, and there's no issue to discuss with them, as they have only aroused our dismay. The decision was announced by Kim Yo-jong and Kim Yong-chol, former top nuclear envoy with a reputation as a hardliner who appeared sidelined since talks broke down with Washington. Pyongyang officials have decided to treat South Korea as an enemy, the report said, adding that they discussed phased plans to make the betrayers and riffraff pay for their crimes. Officials from the two Koreas have been holding twice-day phone conversations at 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. since the liaison office was established in 2018. The North Korean delegation at the liaison office did not answer phone calls from South Korea on Tuesday morning nor on Monday morning for the first time since 2018, South Korea's unification ministry said, although a call Monday afternoon was answered. South Korea's defense ministry said calls to the North via military hotlines also went unanswered on Tuesday. The cross-border phone lines were established in 2018 as an outcome of peace talks between Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. The inter-Korean hotlines are the fundamental means of communication which should be maintained as per agreement between the Koreas. South Korea's unification ministry said, our government will keep the agreements between the two Koreas and make efforts toward peace and prosperity on the peninsula. Experts said Pyongyang appeared to be piling on pressure ahead of the 20th anniversary of the agreement on June 15th that was intended, or June 15, 2000 rather, that was intended to pave the way for improved relations. Jean Lee, a Korea expert at the Wilson Center, said North knows the lack of progress in cross-border relations is a sore point for the center-left Moon, who has made rapprochement with Pyongyang a focus of his presidency. North Korea is gaslighting South Korea ahead of the 20th anniversary of that June 15th milestone because they know Seoul wants a relationship so badly, she tweeted, and to distract their own people from the reality of economic hardship. So that is something that we should keep an eye on. Now, could this just be political theater? Maybe. But could it be part of something larger? I think that when you have a fact like this, that's a little different. We have the sisters speaking up. We have this hardliner here, Kim Yong-chol, coming back into the picture, and we see hardliners across the world getting a lot more power. The Jiang Zemin factions within China having a much bigger influence is another example. And those are the people related to the suppression of Tiananmen Square as we go. And we're going to transition here to Hong Kong and take a look at what's been happening there and what some of the fears are that are for those people where the national security law was passed and there's new actions going forward. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Before we do that, just want to remind you guys, and I want to say thank you also. There were so many people who just asked me to keep talking. There were 2 or 3 people who were pretty nasty. And honestly, I remain tempted to be quiet. At some point, I probably will have to be, because I probably get shut down because I'm telling you things you're not allowed to hear. And you'll have to decide even if it offends you, how you feel about that. But for those of you who are helping keep me afloat, who helped with the computer project, I want to thank you for your generosity. For those who send letters, kind words, the email, coronaviruscentral@pm.me. The email is P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine 04442. And then also those who've sent contributions, you really do help. And that's why I keep doing this show. You guys keep me afloat. Just like anything else you want it, keep it coming. CVCPRV is my Venmo. So let's go to the next story here, because I always forget to do that, because honestly, Lord knows I don't really do this for the money, but it does give me enough to keep getting up in the morning and doing this. Business Insider is the next source for we're going to use from this. This piece was written by Rosie Perper 3 hours ago, and it is entitled, China's Secretive Spy Agency, known for kidnapping and torturing dissidents, could operate openly in Hong Kong under new national security laws. So, what often happens after you pass a big shiny bill, like the National Security Act of 1947 in the United States, is you start having agencies doing things. And I mention that because that's what helped create the CIA in the United States. And I don't know how many of you have a positive opinion of that agency. I certainly do not. And we've had a whole lot of coups and things happen around the world, including the whole situation in Iran. You can research what they did with Mossadegh, who was the elected president there in 1953, if you're curious. And it's just one in a whole series of things. But China going ahead and publicly admitting they would do this in Hong Kong is part of their nationalization. So we're going to take a look at what actually people are afraid is happening there. And these are the stories you're never going to hear about people who disappear. And there might be complaints, but I guarantee you less and less that's going to come out, especially as we see us move onto a more militaristic footing. Because absent the benefit that China got for Hong Kong to be an economic mode into the world for people to buy things, as you see other countries, especially in the Anglosphere, pulling out. You see the United States pulling out. You see issues with Australia, with the UK, with India, with basically the English-speaking world, I would say, is pretty wide at this point. What you'll see is China has no reason to keep up the facade of trying to go ahead and have a democratic front to have economic relationships with countries that have decreasing economic relationships with China. And China has already had for some time this idea between the Belt and Road Initiative. They're going to bring the resources they in through direct relationships, whether it be the land route through Pakistan, Iran to the Middle East, or into potentially Europe through Russia. They had an alternate theory about how they wanted to do this, where they didn't have to deal with all these sort of inconvenient intermediaries from how they wanted to run their country. And at this point, nationalism isn't going to be a hard sell anywhere. So China being in that situation, you should expect that they're going to begin reeling in Hong Kong very quickly, and financial sanctions will only accelerate the sort of nationalistic impulse that will lead to the suppression of dissidents in China. And what we will see, and it's a fair question people will ask, how much of this dissident movement is legitimate, how much of it's funded by state actors, and the answer is yes. I mean, in the same way probably happens in the United States. I have no doubt that some of the money that's ultimately funding these protests in the United States is ultimately laundered from state actors like China. Doesn't mean necessarily the protests aren't legitimate, but big protests require a lot of money. A lot of money comes from big actors who are mad at other ones. So is it possible China's spending money to destabilize the United States at the same time the United States is likely spending money to destabilize China? Perhaps in the best case scenario, taking advantage of organic movements? The answer is yes, and that's part of the game that's at play here. As we look at things, that there are two different levels. I mean, if you want to put it on a four-sided axis, on two sides of the table are like on a chessboard, let's say, one side of the table is the United States and one side of the table is China, okay? But if you flip that table 90 degrees, you would see that there are four sides, and the other side is a sort of globalist or authoritarian, social credit score, universalist, ideological view of the world that's one way, and then on the other side of it, sort of a nationalist, liberty-based, different way of looking at things. And those sides you could draw differently, I don't dispute that, but that you have to see all those different sides at once, and then you see how people can manipulate to try to get to entities that are sympathetic to what they believe. And that is something China is going to be good at, because that's how they fight warfare. They fight warfare as a cultural battle, not just a military one. And I think we need to remember that's, in fact, the way wars have usually been fought. You know, that Trojan horse that won the War of Troy, that wasn't a military gambit, it was a stratagem. And you need to think deceptively if you're going to understand how this actually works. So, to the article. China's secretive state security agency, which is known to monitor and detain those deemed a threat to the Chinese state, could operate more overtly in Hong Kong if new national security laws are passed. The new legislation that China is unilaterally pushing on Hong Kong may give way for the Ministry of State Security to establish an official presence in the city, Axios reported. Little is known about the highly secretive spy agency, though it has been accused of masterminding operations to steal U.S. state secrets and torturing dissidents. The agency is also believed to have orchestrated the highly publicized kidnappings of the 5 Causeway Bay booksellers who were taken from Hong Kong and turned up in mainland custody. And this is where a lot of times bookstores are places where ideas are allowed to spread, and that they go ahead and they fight at that level. So it's a very different thing than how we're used to thinking about it, where we have freedom of speech, and for the Hong Kongers as well, who lived under UK Commonwealth law for a very long time. Last month, China voted to move forward with new national security legislation for Hong Kong in a major blow to the city's autonomy. The proposal was voted on by the annual National People's Congress, China's rubber-stamp parliament, and allows the country to unilaterally draft and enforce national security laws in Hong Kong in the near future. The next step is for China's top legislative body to draft the official text for the new laws, which Beijing said should be done at, quote, an early date, according to Agence France Presse. Chinese authorities have not yet released the full details of the proposal, though it will likely outlaw the promotion of secession, subversion, and foreign interference. And doesn't that sound like something broad to each of you? It does to me. A previous draft of the proposal said when needed, relevant national security organs of the Central People's Government will set up agencies in Hong Kong to fulfill relevant duties to safeguard national security in accordance with the law. According to Axios, the new laws will likely allow China's security agency to create a framework for extraditing targets in Hong Kong to the mainland. Or, in a more alarming scenario, the legislation could allow the security agency to simply apprehend people and sweep them over the border. And we already see that's been done before privately. Expect to see more of that openly. If Chinese intelligence agencies are allowed to operate openly and efficiently, then that becomes an alternative center of power to the law enforcement agencies that Hong Kong government currently has, one that would undoubtedly have legal privacy in the jurisdiction, said Rodney Farron, former senior CIA officer, to Axios. Critics have said that once the bill is passed, it could spell the end of Hong Kong's autonomy, and the United States has already made that judgment, as have many other countries. Hong Kong currently operates under a one country, two systems rule with China, affording it a high degree of autonomy from the mainland and allowing it to maintain its own political, legal, and economic systems separate from China until 2047. But China has grown increasingly overbearing in its policies toward Hong Kong in recent years, leading to intensified protests and heightened calls for the city to move toward full democracy. Beijing has been intensifying the pressure on the city over the last decade, and this moves the campaign of repression to a new, more concerning phase, says Ben Bland, research fellow at Australia's Lowy Institute and an author of a book on Hong Kong, to Business Insider. So that is what's happening in Hong Kong. You're not necessarily hearing a lot about it because they are consolidating control over there. And what does that mean? Well, the United States is not very happy about that. Taiwan is apoplectic about it, and that might explain the next story we're going to tell, which is, at the heart of this conflict continues to be the issue of Taiwan. And interestingly, actually, when you look at a lot of the media, we quote different medias, and you look at things like NTD, Epoch Times, who've done a good job covering a lot of things, but you want to talk about biases, those are Taiwanese supportive and partially owned media. So a lot of actually the evolving, interestingly, some of the right-wing media that's being pushed in the United States actually has a lot of financial support from Taiwan. And interestingly as well, some of the left-wing media has support from China. The United States has a really weird problem. We tend to think that private capital is separate from public governments, and it really isn't. And if you need any proof of that, just think of how campaign contributions control candidates on all sides of the political aisle. But what happens is we deal with a lot of state propaganda that happens indirectly. Now, China won't go ahead and have Xinhua be a national TV station in the United States, but they very easily could have a private industry group, let's say Tencent, for instance, that is partially owned by the state government that owns, a percentage of Spotify, maybe a key percentage, and puts a lot of money in there and then says, hey, we don't like what Coronavirus Central says. It talks badly about China. Shut him down. And that is how they have an impact. And that, incidentally, is probably why I'm not on Spotify anymore, even though I had a pretty large audience there and I didn't do anything afoul of their terms of service. Now, this happens, and it happens in both directions because we have this idea that there's a wall between the private sector and the public sector. That wall is made of Swiss cheese, with gigantic holes designed to be big enough to run a whole convoy of corruption through. And that one of the things that, as we go through our discussions and awareness of what the world looks like, is you have to understand just because you think the world has these lines, separation between church and state, separations between corporation and state, separations between churches and corporations, that in truth, there are other ways you can connect these dots, and other countries and other civilizations do so. And as we go ahead and look at this and you see this, remember, and this goes back to the point of media bias, is that ultimately that utility is the means by which you should begin to connect pieces if you want the best understanding. And I will say, in a system like the Western system, where making money is supposedly the actual purpose of media, and if you admit it, I mean, this is what they're, I mean, six corporations control over 90% of the broadcast media in the United States, and what's the purpose of a corporation? To make money for its shareholders. So ultimately, you end up with these weird, perverse situations where, on the one hand, a corporation could be doing right by its theoretical customers by making a lot of money, but destroying its society over there because if the money's coming from untoward sources with questionable means. And once upon a time, the United States had very vigorous entities, as other countries sometimes do, to prevent these sorts of relationships. But the rise of globalization, as well as, the idea that there are certain things you don't question because they fit a certain programming method. That's where cancel culture comes from. That's where the glut of people getting fired right now for saying things that are, politically incorrect. Someone said all lives matter and lost their job. I mean, do you think that's appropriate? But I tell you who would think that's appropriate, the People's Republic of China, who puts a lot of money into the U.S. market. We've talked about the Confucius Institute, the 10,000 talents, and that's just the money above board. We're not even talking about the fact they found $350,000 in Michigan that was just brought in, I think it was Wisconsin, I apologize, that was brought in as counterfeit money, But who knows? But as we go through all this, remember, that's what asymmetrical warfare would look like if you were doing it very intelligently. And the United States does so as well. We just don't talk about it. The CIA does that on behalf of the Federal Reserve, which uses the United States. That's the way the world really works. But people don't understand that. But in this story, America serves as the mercenary force, sadly, for these sort of issues, and that you do have that level of cross-national conflict, and that's the level we're focused on today. So, what does U.S. have as an asset? A big military that we like to throw around. So we go to Stars and Stripes at stripes.com, which is a long-standing magazine that covers military issues. And this piece was written by Joseph Ditzler on June 8th, 2020, just to show provocations and the fact that this escalation is continuing. Navy sends another guided missile destroyer through the Taiwan Strait. Tokyo. The guided missile destroyer USS Russell passed through the Taiwan Strait last week, the Navy's seventh such transit this year, and the second in 3 weeks as the U.S. and China continue to step up their activities in the Western Pacific. The Russell steamed through the 110-mile wide strait separating the island of Taiwan from mainland China over Thursday and Friday, according to a statement from Commander Rhian Momsen, spokeswoman for the 7th Fleet. The Russell transited the strait in accordance with international law, she said in an email Monday. The ship's passage demonstrates the U.S. commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. All right, so let's take a step back here. So there was a guy way back when, in the 1860s, 70s, I think. His name was Alfred Mahan, and he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And it's sort of one of the key books, if you've ever been in the United States Navy or you're a student of military history. It basically suggests that many of the world powers have been able to have control over the world because they were able to exert dominant naval influence. And he wrote this with a mind to the overwhelming power of the British Empire that was called at that time the Empire in which the sun never set because of all its colonial holdings, its ability to very quickly move goods and services to create wealth, and to move force, including the infamous British Marines and redcoats that went around everywhere, upon which the United States Marines was at least somewhat inspired. I mention all this because the United States globally has been seen as useful for the corporate world and for basically international law by providing a gigantic navy that ensures freedom of navigation, minus a world of piracy and zones of control. There were many times in history where people fought over the idea that ships could go or could not go into certain waters, and at this point we have certain established limits. I forget how many miles it is, like 3 miles off a coast, and then I think it's like 12 miles or 15 miles. There's a special exclusion zone. It's where countries have unique rights, and this goes to the drilling rights for oil. It goes for harvesting for fish. It goes for all sorts of things, and it ultimately goes to the role of where commerce goes because it keeps certain trade routes open. Where things get narrow. The Straits of Taiwan is one example. Suez Canal, you could think of one. If America split apart, the St. Lawrence River or Mississippi River could serve similar roles as in that if you would imagine a divided America, or Canada for that matter. But the point is that the freedom of navigation is not an absolute. It's just something that has been long defended through the United States, and that could change as this goes forward. And that's one of the reasons why the U.S. Navy does things like this from its own perspective, but it also does it to provoke China and says, do you want to try it? And that was one of the reasons why this is important, because China does not want anyone in that strait that is not Chinese or not, let's say if you're right there, if you're Taiwanese fishers, they don't have an issue with that. But that is a security risk for them, because the way China sees the world is they're encircled by the United States, by bases in Taiwan, Okinawa, Japan, and South Korea that are designed to hem China in, which is actually true. And so when you see China getting mad about that, this is part of why they would do that. And the fact that we are upping the number of transits through there is a way of saying, that we're watching from the United States perspective. Okay, so China typically protests U.S. presence in the Strait, but military and foreign affairs officials were silent as of Monday. State-run media, however, took note. The English-language Global Times newspaper in a report Friday quoted Chinese military expert Song Zhongping, who characterized the Brussels transit as a provocation to the Chinese mainland. Summing up other analysts, the report stated, the move is not only preparing the U.S. military for potential conflict in the region, an attempt to provoke the Chinese mainland, but also an attempt to shift domestic pressure from widespread protest, the coronavirus, and a poor economy for which the Chinese mainland should maintain its strategic focus and not dance to the U.S. tune. So you see how China is literally commenting on what's happening in the United States as part of why the United States shouldn't be trusted. And now, is that a question of them taking advantage of an opportunity, or is it part of a strategy that they themselves have employed? You're not supposed to know the answer to that question, which is why you should be asking it. The pace of naval operations picked up this year as both nations seek advantage against the backdrop of the pandemic and the resulting international economic slowdown. In addition to its presence in the Taiwan Strait, the Navy has sent warships past contested areas of the South China Sea, the territory that China considers its own. China regards Taiwan as a breakaway province in the strait as territorial waters. The U.S., under the One China policy, acknowledges that Beijing considers Taiwan part of China, and that was worked out by Nixon and Kissinger back in the 70s. But there are exceptions to that, and in fact, the United States is obliged by treaty to defend Taiwan if it is attacked by China. And it says here, however, the United States provides aid to the self-governing island's defense. The Global Times, quoting Song, said U.S. transit send the wrong signal to, quote, Taiwan secessionists, or what you would call the Democrats, a Democratic Party, not Democratic in the U.S. sense, but, who support democracy in Taiwan, by letting them think the U.S. military is backing them up. And I'm sure the U.S. military is backing them up, and I'd be stunned if we're not giving them extra resources at this point. In mid-May, the U.S. sent the guided missile destroyer USS McCampbell through the strait a week ahead of the inauguration of Taiwan's incumbent president, Tsai Ing-wen, who opposes reunification with China. China demonstrated its maritime might in April when its Liaoning carrier passed twice through the Miyako Strait, a 155-mile wide corridor separating the Japanese islands of Miyako and Okinawa, and that's south of Japan, just, the mainland of, Honshu's the big island, Kyushu, I think, if I remember right, it's a smaller island down there. The Chinese, in late May, sent its first domestically built aircraft carrier, the Shandong, from the Dalian shipyard out for sea trials, according to the South China Morning Post. The Hong Kong-based newspaper reported on May 29th that a coronavirus outbreak had previously interrupted the carrier's training regime. It left Dalian on May 25th for training in the northern Yellow Sea, according to a June 2nd report in Naval News. So that is interesting. And Chinese carriers sailing around Okinawa is a big deal because that's where the U.S. keeps much of its forces. There are a number of different Marine bases that are there. Not without controversy as stumps up from year to year, but there is certainly a very, very heavy U.S. presence on Okinawa. And just like if a conflict does break out, I will just tell you, and I'm not predicting it immediately, but Okinawa and Guam are two places you would very quickly want to watch and you would expect would be subject, if China had a sneak attack, to heavy, heavy bombardment. If China could get away from nuking them, I suspect they would, actually. And that would take away the ability of the United States to directly interact for the most part, and probably it might even push Japan away from getting engaged, depending upon the situation at the time. I know it sounds weird, but we live in a weird time, so we have to think about these things. And, looking at things from a hard power analysis sometimes helps recenter what we're dealing with in a bigger sense, because when you see big moves accompanying sort of soft culture moves, you realize that there's a much bigger plot afoot. And the fact that this is all moving so quickly, especially when you see how much effort is being thrown into protests at a time when it's only going to get Americans sick, to me, it screams screams that there's big money behind this as part of a larger agenda that's happening on a preset schedule. And we're all just watching this go forward. If you chase the money, you can figure out sometimes by looking at whose actors are paying for things and looking at what they say for themselves. People are usually pretty open. Even countries that you would think of as very questionable actors are usually pretty open about what their intentions are in terms of their outputs they want to get. It's the tactics by which they get there they get sneaky about. And people have a tendency to admit a lot if you know how to read what they're saying and what they're not saying, because that's usually the big hint. But this piece is from thedrive.com, which does a lot of good jobs of covering war and logistics. So we're going to look at this piece by Joseph Trevitik that was written, Taiwanese fighters drive Chinese jets after Navy transport plane flies over the island. The unusual flight certainly caught the attention of Beijing, which appears to be more focused on Taiwan's independence than ever before. And this is a way of demonstrating to you the escalation that's ongoing. And I want you to keep an eye on this, that the U.S. is playing into it, Taiwan is playing into it, China is playing into it. Everyone is upping their tension level, and that means everyone is thinking the same sort of thing. Something is likely to go down soon, much more likely. Will it actually happen? We'll see. I don't know, but is there every bit of reason to suspect it may? Absolutely. And if the United States ends up getting into major problems, and one thing I'm not covering as well as I should be, although I'll add a piece in here about it because I think it's relevant to this, is the fact that the U.S. military is being tested because the U.S. military is now becoming divorced from the civilian leadership in a lot of ways. So, to continue, Taiwanese fighter jets reportedly drove off China's Su-30 flankers after the latter briefly entered the island's air defense identification zone earlier today. And that's something that's been happening for many, many years. Russia does this in the Arctic Circle all the time. It's a standard thing that the militaries test one another's readiness that way. It just is part of what happens. It's like border guards throwing rocks at each other. It's as old as humanity itself. That incident came after a U.S. Navy C-48 Clipper passenger transport aircraft flew an extremely unusual route over Taiwan's western coast, a flight that was almost sure to draw some form of rebuke from authorities in Beijing, who consider the island part of the country's sovereign territory. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense announced that the aerial altercation had occurred to the southwest of the island on June 9, 2020. The ministry's statement said that unspecified Taiwanese Air Force fighter jets had intercepted the Chinese flankers and issued verbal warnings for them to leave the area before more forcefully driving them out of the area. Following an increase in Chinese military flights around the island in recent years, Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen, who won a second term in landslide in January, has previously said that Taiwanese jets would conduct a forceful expulsion of any Chinese combat aircraft that crossed the so-called median line in the Taiwan Strait. The median line is the de facto boundary between the island and the People's Republic of China and the mainland, the latter of which sees Taiwan as an integral part of its national territory. The Chinese People's Liberation Army has been conducting major exercises in the South China Sea to the southeast of Taiwan, including with its new aircraft carrier, the Shandong, which many experts and observers have taken to be a signal aimed at Taiwanese authorities. Beijing routinely threatens to use military force if the government in Taipei moves to formally declare independence. Notably, the PLA's largest land training facility at Zhihe, which you can read about in this recent war zone feature, has a highly accurate mock-up of Taiwan's presidential office building, as well as one representing the Taiwanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs building and other full-scale urban structures. The rhetoric between Beijing and Taipei had ratcheted up substantially after Tsai's election of victory and has grown even more heated following her inauguration, in which she said that the island would move to further distance itself politically from the mainland. In addition to widespread domestic support for her government, the Taiwanese president has also enjoyed a particularly strong and close relationship with U.S. President Donald Trump's administration. Taipei has secured unprecedented arms deals in the past year or so, including getting approval to purchase the new advanced Block 70 variants of the F-16 CD fighter jet, something the government in Beijing has said would be, quote, a red line issue, end quote, in the past. The United States technically recognizes the People's Republic of China as the only legitimate government in China, but has reserved the right to continue to engage with Taiwan and help provide for its defense until its final status is officially resolved. As such, as friction between Beijing and Taipei has increased, the U.S. military has stepped up so-called freedom of navigation patrols through the Taiwan Strait, sending both ships and planes through the area as a demonstration of the U.S. ongoing commitment to Taiwan. The C-40A flight, which took place on June 9th before the incident between Chinese and Taiwanese fighter jets, appears to be another example of that. However, while the median line in the Taiwan Strait and the airspace above it is technically neutral international space, the Clipper's route took it through actual Taiwanese airspace, where U.S. military aircraft generally don't venture. Plane spotters using online flight tracking software first noticed the C-40A appearing to leave Kadena Air Base on the Japanese island of Okinawa and then head south toward Taiwan. The aircraft, which has the Bureau number serial number 169036, and is assigned to the U.S. Navy Reserve's Fleet Logistics Support Squadron 61, based at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island in Washington State, then passed near Taipei on Taiwan's northern tip before heading south along the coast. Flight tracking data shows the aircraft then continued south into the South China Sea and eventually made its way to Utapao Airport in Thailand. After leaving there, it appeared to fly toward the strategic island of Guam in the South Pacific. And they show pictures of the flight patterns. And this is something they do to test things, see what sort of responses are out there, but it's interesting. The flight over Taiwan proper is a much more pointed demonstration of the de facto independence of the island and its ability to set its own rules about the use of its airspace that more traditional FONOPS, that's flight, be sure to say that again right, 1 second here, freedom of navigation patrols. Okay, so that's what that is. The Taiwan Times newspaper reported that Shi Shunwen, spokesperson for Taiwan's Ministry of Defense, said in a statement the nation's military has full control over the airspace over Taiwan and the current situation is normal, but declined to confirm or deny the C-40A had flown over the western coast. And in theory, you would need America to have Taiwan's permission to do that, and I'm sure they did have it. Taiwan's China Times newspaper also reported the Clipper had made an emergency landing at Qingchanghuang Air Base in the city of Taichung, but there's no evidence this was the case. It's worth noting the C-40A's flight comes after weeks of other unprecedented aerial activity in the Pacific region. This has included a number of long-range sorties by the U.S. Air Force B-1B bombers, many of which were clearly meant to send a message to China as well. The chill in relations between authorities in Taipei and their counterparts to Beijing does not look set to end anytime soon. Relations between the two parties had already seen additional strains this year over the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Chinese government's to force Taiwanese authorities out of international response efforts, as well as the months-long crackdown on protests in Hong Kong over the mainland efforts to curtail that semi-autonomous region's unique freedoms. And you would remember that China went out of their way to make sure they could not get in the WHO as even an observer. Tsai Ing-wen's government says it will look for ways to help Hong Kongers in response to the Chinese Communist Party proceeding with implementing a new draconian national security law covering the latter region, and we've talked about that. With the parties on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, as well as the United States digging in their heels, at least rhetorically, it seems more likely than not we will continue to see more assertive signaling, including aggressive aerial encounters and FONOPs in the near future. So that is what we see. And it comes to a point that's pretty interesting, which is that China is looking at what you're seeing in the American media. They're reading the stories that, frankly, the left celebrates, where you have people like General Mattis, who previously served, saying you shouldn't listen to the commander-in-chief. And if you have a breakdown between civilian and military authority, what better time than to test the military than that? Now, on the other side of it, there's two different ways you could look at it. Well, there's three ways you could look at it. You could look at it as most Americans do, from the narrow perspective of I don't like this or I like this, military good, military bad, based on your ideological perspective, and that's how 95% of the people look at it. You could look at it as 4% of the people might look at it, which is to say, this isn't so good. The military's not listening to the president at the same time that the single biggest national security threat in terms of provocations of a military conflict, the People's Republic of China, is testing things nonstop and threatening violence against not just Hong Kong, but Taiwan. And what does that mean for our ability to offer resistance and uphold our relationships with our allies? That is the foundation of the system that basically keeps the economy of the United States going, and that they are scared to death about that. And yet they look at this and say, this is one of those things, and that it will be tested. And then there's a 1% perspective, which I don't think is right, but it would be incredibly canny if true, and it might fit things we saw beforehand, which would be, and I don't think he's this clever, but I want to present the possibility at least, that it could be the case that the division between President Trump and the military is being overwrought in a way as a forms of deception to make China think that the military, in fact, and the presidency are more at odds with one another, understanding, as they likely do, that a lot of these protests ultimately have a source of funding that traces back to the People's Republic of China. And if you understand that part of it, you understand, as Sun Tzu himself said, that all war is deception. That he talked about that, not with that exact quote, but essentially through this, that if you understand that, the idea that it looks like there's massive division happening that is leading to real destruction in the U.S. streets in terms of the anger that's being expressed by people. But there's a difference between the protesters being the cause and being a symptom of certain things, and I would suggest that the reason these things are coming out is much more symptomatic than causal. And I know people would disagree with that, but that's because we have a heightened sense of our own importance. There is the possibility that this is being set as sort of a more complex trap. And I don't know what's actually true. The problem with deceitful strategies is you really don't know. But in order to add a little bit of color to this, let's give it some context. So I went and grabbed an article. This is from War on the Rocks, National Security for Insiders by Insiders. They do a good job of covering stuff like this. So let's look at the security aspects of the military not following the orders of the commander-in-chief, and let's go ahead and speculate this out just a little bit so that you understand the real risks that are out there. And I'm going to try to do this from a neutral perspective and also from the perspective of what it means from an external threat. So rather than thinking you're an American if you're listening, because most of our audience is Americans, think of this from the perspective of what you would try to do if you were China fighting a war against America and you were going to try to destabilize it. But this will give us a glimpse into the problem the military has. June 10th, 2020, this was published. Would the U.S. military repress protesters? Lessons from the Arab Spring. And this was written by Riza Brooks and Sharon Grewal. In early June, President Donald Trump threatened to unleash active duty troops on American citizens protesting the killing of George Floyd. As he put it on June 1st, if governors do not, quote, dominate the streets, he will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem, end quote. Some of his top supporters, such as Senator Tom Cotton, strongly encouraged him, arguing that deploying the military was essential for an overwhelming show of force to disperse, detain, and ultimately deter lawbreakers. It's important to note that Senator Cotton is actually a veteran himself who served in Iraq here. So he represents a military mindset. At one point, Trump appears to have considered sending as many as 10,000 active duty military personnel into the streets. As the Secretary of the Army put it, we came right up to the edge of bringing active duty troops here. Usually we hear about stories where militaries being asked to repress protests and dictatorships, not in countries with long-standing democratic traditions like the United States. Yet it appears Trump had been willing to order the U.S. military to help police citizens and potentially, if circumstances arose, use force against them. Americans were put in the remarkable position of wondering whether the U.S. military would follow through on the threat. As one journalist put it, will they protect us or will they shoot us? To answer this question, we look to lessons from cases around the world in which militaries are more regularly asked to repress mass protests. Specifically, we draw on our experience studying military responses to protests during the Arab Spring of 2011, especially those of the Tunisian and Egyptian militaries. And I think it's important to note here that those were very, very heavily funded through the CIA, so that you be aware. You can go look, actually Google played a key role in setting these forward, so that whole nexus that you see between Silicon Valley, the CIA, and the deep state exists, and it happens, but now we're seeing it played out in the United States. So keep in mind as we look at this that those forces are in play and those actors are very relevant, especially as we see everyone getting purged from media yet again who doesn't go ahead and support a certain position. In those cases, training, professionalism, the composition and cohesion of the armed forces, and the military's reputation were key factors in the handling of mass protests. Obviously, the United States is not Egypt or Tunisia in 2011. Nonetheless, those examples offer important insight into the factors that might drive U.S. military response if it were ordered by the president to confront protests in cities across the country. Lessons from abroad. In early 2011, millions of people took to the streets across the Arab world to protest police brutality, income inequality, corruption, and dictatorship. With the police overwhelmed, militaries were deployed in 6 countries and had to choose whether to forcefully repress these mass protests. In Egypt and Tunisia, militaries chose not to use force in 2011, although the Egyptian military has done so many times since, and the Tunisian military has also done so historically. Other militaries responded differently. Some, such as Syria and Bahrain, used force to disperse protesters. Other militaries, like those in Libya and Yemen, fractured, with parts of the military supporting the government and repressing protesters, and others defecting from it. And Yemen has had a particularly nasty civil war, where the government's been supported by Saudi Arabia, the rebels have been supported by Iran, and it's just been a disaster over there. And that's something you would expect to happen when militaries are fractured, something that's a very real risk in the United States, to be honest with you. Scholars have spent significant time studying the factors that guided these militaries' responses to the early 2011 protests. To be sure, there are many important differences with respect to the law, norms, and traditions between the American military and these militaries. None of these countries were democracies, and the United States has a long tradition of the military staying out of domestic politics. Unlike these militaries, the United States also maintains and adheres to a complex set of laws and procedures governing the deployments of the National Guard and federal forces. In addition, the pathway through which the regular military might be sent to the streets contains many steps and contingencies. The Secretary of Defense would likely have to authorize the deployment of active forces, and the rules of engagements for federal troops would have to be distributed. In addition, if a local commander issued a clearly illegal order to the troops deployed to a protest area, military personnel would likely disobey it. It would be incumbent on them to do so. Still, the possibility that regular military forces would be put in a situation in which they were given legal orders to disperse protests or assist police in a violent episode caused significant angst among retired military leaders during the first week of June. Now, so we got to take a step back here. I got to say this. A lot of the retired military leaders, in order to get appointed a general, or if you have to get to a certain rank, I think if I remember right, if it's higher than 05, which is anything from a lieutenant colonel or lieutenant commander higher, and I might be wrong about that, it might be commander, but to get it has to be approved by Congress. So officials at the highest level of the American military, the officers, are highly political. And what happened was, over years, you've seen different types of generals come in. There was one group of generals who came in under George W. Bush. Obama got rid of a lot of them. There were tons of generals let go, given their dismissal, essentially. And a whole bunch of different groups went out there. And then you had a different set of generals and admirals that Trump has tried to bring in. And this is one of the quiet stories that's been happening. It doesn't get covered at all in the American media, but it's out there. What generals you have determine what outcomes you will get. And what the generals we have are like now, it's no accident that a lot of people who are really upset are people who have either A, been around Washington a long time, or B, who had served under previous administrations and were sort of inherited by Trump. Conversely, there are generals in there who probably see this very differently, and how they see the broadening outlook really is a heart of this story. We don't know the answer to that. It's something you should try to figure out, and you will have a very hard time, but it will probably play a key role in how America shakes out in the next 6 months, and if you have the ability to do so, and I'll be looking, we'll be talking about that. Because I want you to understand something. Laws are only worth their people's willingness to follow them. On the one hand, protesters in the streets will be claiming that, we want the law to be defended to keep us safe, but you don't want the law to be defended to keep property safe. And what you are seeing is the subversion of law by both sides, to be very clear, in support of their different ideological interests and concerns, and that's domestic politics in the United States. Whether the military can remain above that fray is part of the challenge of cultural warfare, because as the culture falls apart and the people as individuals are drawn to sides they very much believe in, either the law, order, authoritarian view of the right or the sort of social justice view of the left, you see that tearing apart of the country as a deliberate effort that's being made, and the military very well may not be able to escape it, because asking someone to defend a law that goes against their conscience is very, very difficult. And that is at the heart of the American problem, that a lot of people who have very different and divergent views, that's why I used to write books about civil wars happening in this country, cannot coexist under their idea, because they have a different idea of what's good, what's right, what's just, and the law ends up being mere corollary to this. And hiding behind the law, which is what people would argue police brutality ultimately comes down to, saying you can't judge them because they're police, is the very argument that the protesters are trying to destabilize. But destabilize that at a national level, and that's when America breaks and you have the Civil War. And their own success is likely to cause the division of the United States from the ability to be an effective entity, which is something the military doesn't want to get involved with, may not be able to escape, and China's probing at the periphery, as is Russia and other actors, because ultimately they have their own interest, and the dissolution of the American hegemonic empire of our military, because we are getting drawn back home. Like the 9,500 troops Trump has moved, which I don't know where they ended up, if they ended up in Poland or if they left Germany and they went somewhere else. Those are questions that we will have to absolutely look at as we go forward. Okay, so let's see what else. But I want to continue the story. I'm giving you this all as backdrop to let you know that just because someone swears an oath, all sorts of people swear oaths and they ignore them all the time. Expecting people to just hold to their word or to laws is a very simplistic and frankly wrong view of history. So you have to understand motives and really look deeply into this. Let's see here. So we were saying still the possibility of regular military forces would be put in a situation in which they were given legal orders to disperse protests or assist police in a violent episode caused significant angst among retired military leaders during the first week of June. In addition, given that the president and some of his supporters pushed for an aggressive response to protests and to deploy active duty troops, it is a scenario worth considering. Drawing on the lessons of the Arab Spring, we outlined how 5 considerations: training, professionalism, composition, cohesion, and reputation might shape the U.S. military response to mass protests. So, training. The training of the military is one important factor that might affect whether or not the U.S. military would assist in repressing protests. Some military units, particularly in the military police and National Guard, are trained to handle civil disturbances. Many others, such as the infantry battalion that had been deployed to bases outside D.C., have not had that experience. In addition, the preparation that Army units receive might not include how to use non-lethal methods, leaving them unprepared to deal with the current crisis. Notably, retired military leaders were especially alarmed by the use of regular military troops because of the lack of training for domestic roles, a sentiment that was echoed by service members themselves. As one Army staff sergeant told Military Times, quote, "My troops are not trained in crowd control tactics. They are trained to meet and defeat with deadly force any enemy of the United States who is attacking us. My troops do not have the mindset to just allow someone to throw things at them." End quote. Such training was also an important determinant of how the military responded to protesters in the Arab Spring cases. Although different in the details, Tunisia also has a National Guard unit to reinforce the police, and it was deployed before the military in 2011. But Tunisia's military units had also been given occasional training in civil disturbances since the 90s, especially part of their involvement in UN peacekeeping operations. As a result, when they were sent into the streets in 2011, they were better able to de-escalate confrontations with protesters than other militaries in the region. In the absence of sufficient training or experience in managing civil disturbances in the United States could inflame tensions and lead to disastrous outcomes if active forces are asked to intervene in protest. Number 2, professionalism. The military's level of professionalism and loyalty to the state rather than the president can also be an important factor, as some scholars argued it was in Tunisia and Egypt in 2011. In the United States, senior officers have invoked this professional allegiance to push back on the idea that the military should be involved in illegally repressing U.S. citizens. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, observed that every member of the U.S. military swears an oath to support and defend the Constitution and the values embedded within it, a sentiment later echoed by the Chief of the National Guard Bureau. As retired General and former Secretary of Defense James Mattis put it, "Never did I dream that troops taking that same oath would be ordered under any circumstances to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens." Both retired General Martin Dempsey and retired Admiral Mike Mullen concurred, "Our fellow citizens are not the enemy." So this gets tricky, too, because this is one of the things that's hard. In the United States, we've had this ongoing issue where the bureaucracy has separated from the elected government, done things above, beyond, and separate from what's happening in America, including the connections between certain law enforcement agencies and the protesters that we've actually seen come out from time to time. And the fact that the government has been seen as being an entity with an ideological impulse separately has really made this different for what's out there, and that basically the right at this point questions the basic loyalty of the bureaucracy in the United States to the idea of the Constitution, instead in support of the development of the state in support of a different way of viewing things, and that makes this harder to go. And I'm sure generals have their own opinions about it, and no one wants to be first. It's interesting that up until the week which he took power, Pinochet claimed to be the most loyal supporter of the existing structure in Chile. Things change quickly. Keep an eye on that. And I will say, if you see a lot of generals moving around in different positions, it's usually a sign something's coming down the pike. The situation, however, is more complicated for enlisted military personnel who, in addition to pledging to support the Constitution, also pledged to obey the orders of the president. In addition, since it might be difficult to make a split-second decision about the legality of an order, most troops can be expected to obey. Training and socialization also instill discipline and subordination to authority into military forces so that they follow orders. This can be good news if those orders require forbearance, that if rules of engagement require the troops deployed exercise significant restraint or act strictly in a behind-the-scenes supportive capacity. More worrisome would be the outcome if legal orders nonetheless encourage escalation. Military forces might be asked in clearing a particular area, bringing them into conflict with protesters. Alternatively, a protester might act aggressively and elicit a response by police that escalates quickly into a broader confrontation, drawing troops into the chaos. There is also the possibility some military on their own would decide to confront protesters, something that has happened with police provoking and attacking protesters this past week. In these latter scenarios, two likely things can determine how military personnel respond: composition and cohesion. The first is the composition of the military and what is sometimes referred to as the social distance between protesters and military personnel. When soldiers and protesters largely come from different ethnic or sectarian groups, as in Syria or Bahrain in 2011, soldiers are much more likely to repress the outgroup. And this is real-life ethnocentrism. It happens. And I know people don't want to believe that. I know people find it offensive. The truth is people are more likely to look out for people like themselves. It's across all groups, across all history. It's the way it is. But when soldiers identify with the people they are ordered to repress, they are more likely to demonstrate forbearance. This occurred in Egypt in 2011 when some junior officers, sympathizing with the demands of the protesters, threw down their rifles and joined them in protest. Protesters can also directly highlight their similarities and fraternize with the soldiers, as Egyptians also did. These are proven techniques of nonviolent resistance. The Tennessee National Guard laid down its riot shields when protesters calmly asked them to, in tactics evocative of what the Arab activists did in 2011. And you see this happening in some places, honestly, where the protesters are actively engaging and trying to get certain elements of the government to do so. Some are doing so, some are not. And I think that itself is telling of what we're going to be dealing with in the future, that the division is going to be very difficult to get past. How much do military units in the United States identify with today's protesters? On the one hand, the officer corps of the U.S. military is largely white and Republican. In 2016, 72% of active duty Army officers identified as white, as did 80% of Army National Guard officers. Surveys since the 1970s have also shown a growing partisan skew, with a 2009 survey by Heidi Urban of over 4,000 Army officers showing 60% identified as Republican and only 9% as Democrat. The partisan bias in favor of Republicans might render them more receptive to Trump's call to aggressively confront protesters and perhaps in some cases less sympathetic to the protesters' concerns about racial justice. On the other hand, there is a sizable minority, especially among the Army's enlisted ranks, that may identify with protesters. In 2016, 47% of active duty Army soldiers identified as Black, Hispanic, Asian, or other, as did 32% of Army National Guard soldiers. This matters because even if officers order their soldiers to confront protesters, they cannot be sure that all of them will follow. Some soldiers may very well refuse, desert, or even attempt to defend protesters. That fear of splitting the ranks may lead senior officers to prefer not to put the military into such a situation at all. And that's, by the way, my insert. This is likely what we're dealing with here. Similarly, concerns over cohesion were one reason why some military leaders during the Arab Spring protests of 2011 refrained from ordering their troops to fire. However, the senior leadership could also selectively choose units without many people of color to maximize social distance with protesters. In that vein, there do appear to be some soldiers who may be receptive to repression. White supremacist views appear to be more widespread in the military than the general U.S. population. Research by Tatish Nieta and Melinda Tarsi finds that white veterans express more negative views of blacks relative to white civilians, especially in the all-volunteer force generation. Although not scientific, a 2019 Military Times poll likewise showed that 36% of troops they've seen evidence of white supremacist and racist ideologies in the military, with 53% of the minorities surveyed reporting racism. I mean, there's a sort of questionable way about the way they frame it, but I think it's fair enough to say that there's a lot of white boys who aren't afraid of a fight in the military, and that would be a larger number than in other areas. I think that's true. As observers recently noted, military bases and monuments still commemorate Confederate generals. Only in 2020 did the Marines ban troops from having Confederate paraphernalia or displaying the Confederate flag, with other services yet to follow suit. And I will say, look, I've talked to a lot of military people about this. Believe me, a lot of military people, and most military people do lean right, and they don't This article, the one thing I don't like about it is it phrases it in a sort of identitarian supremacist ideology, but they don't like the idea that you're going to destroy history and attack certain groups over other groups. And these misunderstandings, whatever position you take on them, are at the heart of how the division is being foisted. And don't think other countries don't understand this. Every other country pretty much outside the Western world operates on an ethno-nationalist basis. Chinese look like Chinese, Indians look like Indians, and who's in and out depends on that. We think of Japan as a well-organized Western nation. Koreans who've lived there for 3 generations are not considered Japanese citizens. Why? Because they're not ethnically Japanese. And so what you see is foreign powers play at this sort of identity role in politics because they understand empires that are based on multi-racial entities often end up fighting one another. And I'm not saying we should go down that path. I'm saying that it's a point that's going to be a weak point. So when you see a whole bunch of money being thrown into Black Lives Matter that's designed to be divisive, understand that it will likely succeed to a very large extent. And you can try to silence and signal against people who don't like that view. That's fine. But ultimately, all you're doing is making a lot more people angrier. And as people get fired by the cancel culture expression, all it's doing is heightening the tensions, which what does that do? It weakens the ability of America to hold together. And the military, just like any other social institution, is subject to the pull of these forces, whatever you individually believe. Even if they're not supremacists, some service members may still be willing to participate in repressing Black Lives Matter, given that some commentators have likened them to terrorists, including the president. Some may simply take the view as the protest wholly unjustified, and they thus may be willing to support aggressive actions taken by police against protesters. While many Americans are sympathetic to the protesters' cause, a sizable minority of Americans believe that either the cause or the methods or the protesters are unjustified. The latest Morning Council poll conducted June 3rd to 5th found that 42% would support calling in the military, including 71% of Republicans. So what you see is this is a division of people who want to fight, really. The Republicans would have no problem with this, except for a few people who basically live off the media in D.C. And I'll tell you because I live in a highly Republican region where that's how people think about it. You don't have to agree. I'm just telling you these facts and how they fit into the story. The president has also been tweeting about the need for law and order, a concept that historically has strong racial overtones. This could shape how troops sent to manage protests react in the event of a clash between police and participants or an unprovoked attack by the police. Once again, it is not difficult to conceive of such a scenario given that there have been incidents of this kind during the George Floyd protests. So let's do a hypothetical, right, for 1 second, how this happens. Seattle has their autonomous zone. Let's say the mayor says, no, you have to break up, we're not doing it. Like, no, you don't have power. We are taking power direct for the people. We have the people's democracy of the Seattle autonomous zone. At that point, you have to say it's an insurrection. And if this were to happen in a city where a Democrat, or God forbid, they do it in a Republican city, you notice this never happens in Republican cities. But if a Democratic mayor or a Republican mayor were to say, no, you don't have the authority, I'm sympathetic to you, but you have to go home, and they don't do it, well, that is the legal definition of an insurrection. The president would be warranted to do the Insurrection Act and send people in there. So maybe in Seattle, you might see the National Guard federalized and put it in there in the future. And, if they bring in boys from Eastern Washington, I guarantee you they're going to look at it a lot different than people do in Seattle. And what ends up happening if they say we're going to fight, well, then you end up with a shooting fight where people are going to take sides, believing based on ideology. And what does that do? That makes the military one more piece at play in an ideological war inside the United States. The military wants to avoid that at all costs because they understand then they're going to be stuck in this fight, this civil war that they see brewing that they are trying to stay above. But how long they can stay above it, I don't know. I think it would be very, very difficult because there's going to be armed resistance one way or another. And whether it ends up being, these protests in the streets now or whether it ends up being, let's say things go down the line a couple months, Biden gets elected, Trump gets pushed aside, and they say, okay, we're going to enact racial justice, like Governor Beshear did, where he said, okay, in Kentucky, we're going to give health care to black people, but not to white people. There's going to be white militias formed that are going to go out there, and then the military is going to have to repress them. And people might say, well, that's justified because that's white supremacy. But ultimately, you are in a position where the military is being forced to make choices between actors who don't want to work together. Sooner or later, this might happen if we don't find a commonality. And is that going to be found? Damned, I don't think so, but we'll see. But this is what the military is trying to stay above. And ultimately, how well they're able to do that at some point is a question of conscience. And I suspect you will start to see people defect if it gets to the point where shooting breaks out one way or another. And I don't know how it doesn't within the next year, however you want it to shake out. That was one of the things I actually wrote about in some of my books, and it pissed a lot of people off, but it's also the truth. And my job isn't, I always tell you here at CV Central, we're not here to tell you what you want to hear. We're here to tell you what's going to happen and how to keep yourself safe. And what I would suggest to everyone, I've had people reach out to me of all sorts of different groups across the U.S., you need to be around people who are like yourself if you want to survive, to be honest with you, in terms of what you believe, in terms of what you look like. And I know that's a harsh recommendation, but, you asked the question, I'll give you the answer. Reputation. A final factor that might affect the willingness to repress U.S. citizens is the military's reputation. Both the Tunisian and Egyptian military's concerns about their reputations were important factors in their decisions not to repress mass protests in 2011. Similar considerations could matter for the American armed forces. Since at least the 1990s, the military has been the most trusted public institution in the U.S., with 83% of respondents having confidence in the military to act in the best interest of the public. This is a remarkable accomplishment, especially given the low rankings Americans give to other institutions, and something to which military leaders are attuned. Even if the military plays a supporting role and there are few confrontations between civilians and police, it only takes one incident gone wrong to incite the anger directed at the military. Protesters may not necessarily be able to differentiate the actions of the military from the police. Troops might be implicated in the eyes of many Americans even if they are not directly participating in police brutality. There are already indications some military personnel harbor these concerns. An active duty Army captain told the Military Times, quote, "I believe the president deploying the military for political reasons and our reputation will be irreparably harmed by the association." A National Guard non-commissioned officer, that's a high-ranking enlisted person, concurred. Cracking down with authoritarianism does nothing but further politicize the military and erode the trust the public has in us. Retired General John Ellen has likewise observed that descending on American citizens could wreck the high regard Americans have for their military. Fears of losing that social standing may be one reason that military see where it goes. Leaders appear to have resisted Trump's desire to use them against protesters. On the other hand, the military's positive reputation may also help to avoid any confrontation altogether. While police have faced the direct ire of the protesters, contributing to an escalation toward classes, the military may be viewed more respectfully. In both Tunisia and Egypt in 2011, protesters reacted to military forces much more favorably than they did police, who were known for their indiscriminate repression of country citizens. Alternatively, protesters might view active duty forces with more wariness, while those forces would be in unfamiliar surroundings. As former chairman of Joint Chiefs Dempsey observed, members of the National Guard are drawn from local communities, and their presence may have a stabilizing presence for that reason. Active forces would be drawn from around the U.S. and not know much about the communities to which they have been sent. That lack of familiarity could increase stress and uncertainty among the troops, compounding tensions if they face off against protesters. And let me say one thing here as an insertion. I am not making the argument in any way, shape, or form that the vast majority of protesters are seeking a violent confrontation. I'm not making that argument at all. In fact, I suspect that's not true. That's the opposite for 95% of them. I suspect a large portion of them are out there because they are genuinely motivated by what they have been conditioned to perceive as a terrible situation. I suspect a significant portion are out there because they're being supported. And I suspect a very small radical portion are there to cause problems. And this is why in politics you have that phrase, the tail wagging the dog. 10,000 people are out there. 2 people are bad. They start shooting at the police. What do the police do in response? The police attack 10,000 people. Do you see how that happens? This is what's called leverage. This is how it works. And this is why Archimedes said, give me a big enough lever, I can move the whole world. These situations that are being created create the opportunity to cause radical change, and it is the very means by which a small group that is well-funded can leverage a very large group with a different cause to have a fight that's very different than what they thought for. And ultimately, the story I always like to tell is we fought World War II to liberate Poland and ended World War II by giving Poland over to another country. These things happen. Be aware of it. And the people who are leaders in these sorts of movements, and trust, you can believe me if you want for one reason. I write these things. I think about these things. I have the book on the thing. Coming Civil War. It's out there. And admittedly, it's written from a very right-wing perspective. But what it talks about is these questions of how you leverage things. And the understanding that a lot of people have is that ultimately, if we have in the United States a system that's unsustainable, there are people who are going to be looking for opportunities to change it to something more akin to their idea of what's just. And I give credit, to be honest with you, to the protesters and the revolutionaries employing them in the field for trying to create a new system that is very much like what they want. The problem is half of America hates it to the point where they will fight for the death to prevent it. And that's true whichever side you lean on. And if you don't understand that, nothing else makes sense. But I tell you who else understands that. The People's Republic of China and all these different entities. So let's look at what they present as the worst and best case scenarios from this piece. How the troops respond to a hypothetical order to repress protesters in the United States could involve similar factors to those that shaped military behavior during the Arab Spring: levels of professionalism, training, composition, cohesion, and reputation. How those factors might combine to shape military behavior in a domestic protest is uncertain. Indeed, if deployed and given authorization to use repressive tactics to confront protesters, much could depend on the particular unit and how its partisan and racial composition interact with that of the protesters in that locality. It may even come down to the discipline or lack thereof of a single soldier reacting in an unfamiliar, acutely stressful environment. The worst-case scenario, a clash involving the military in which a peaceful protester is killed, would have disastrous effects. And I want to just pull one word out. You see this word peaceful out there. Peaceful isn't as simple as like I show up and I'm having peace. If you are doing certain things, there's a whole range between peace and violence that is strategic ambiguity, and that's where these revolutionaries live. What they want to have is called disproportional usage of force, right? And there's whole doctrines written about. A lot of people who spend time in Afghanistan will or Iraq will understand this, and the idea is that you're seen as a bully in warfare, the moral component in warfare, if you're using nukes against people who use pebbles. And that was one of the reasons why in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the rules of engagement were set up where the U.S. military, because of the seeming moral deception in the combat level, were only permitted of using forces of a certain level to fight against them, because otherwise they were thought they would be perceived as bullies by the larger population. And so when you see people throwing sticks and stones, there are some who are looking for that disproportionate response out there. And it's one of those things that revolutionaries learned very early, how to use the perception of force and fairness to shape information warfare. And I know this sounds very technical, and you're like, oh, well, why should they be attacked? But this is something that people do. They understand so much of war. If you really understand war, war is won in the mind. It is a mental game of psychology where you win by being moves ahead. People are predictable in their behaviors, and the very best chess masters, perfect metaphor for war, are the ones who can see the most moves ahead. People who are acting a lot of moves ahead are counting on you responding to immediate impulses in ways that are predictable. That's why you have to be able to change how you think about things if you want to be able to go ahead and offer the ability to understand what might actually happen. And that's why I use this example of these worst case scenarios so you can see what's out here. But anyway, so the worst case scenario, clash involving military in which a peaceful protester is killed, would have disastrous effects on the U.S. public relationship with the military. This has happened before. In May 1974, Ohio National Guardsmen fired into a crowd of demonstrators at Kent State University. 4 were killed and 9 were wounded, sparking student strikes across the country. The best case scenario, if the active duty military were ordered into the streets, is this: its members acquit themselves well and act to protect American citizens exercising their First Amendment rights. That is, military personnel stay true to the oath they took to uphold the Constitution. So we'll see what ends up happening there, but those are the challenges the military is dealing with, and at the same time it's dealing with those challenges, it's dealing with all these foreign provocations. So I wanted to put that piece into this. So you might say, well, Tom, you're putting this story together, and look, yeah, Taiwan and China have been fighting for many, many years, and they have a lot of issues, and Hong Kong is part of China, so what's the big deal there? China and U.S. are pushing forward. So now we're going to go to South Asia, and we're going to look at another piece of this that really will demonstrate that this is a much bigger escalation than you would easily understand. And we're going to go to foreignpolicy.com. This piece is by Anik Joshi, published 3:13 p.m., June 9th, 2020. China is pushing India closer to the United States. Border issues, Pakistan issues, and an aggressive Beijing are causing New Delhi to pick sides in the new Cold War. All right, and to start this, I'm going to give you a 3-minute history lesson on India in the last 100 years or so. Okay, so India ends up getting basically taken over in the British colonial effort, where they had sort of a co-option strategy of the local nobles, where they brought them into the British Empire, and that they ultimately were part and subject to Britain. And as things went forward, in World War II, Britain's strategy had always been, and so many world problems go back to the UK. For our UK listeners, you'll know this. I mean, the problem is decolonialization was a mess, and the idea of divide and conquer, where lines were drawn poorly, like between Iraq and Kuwait and what was previously British Mesopotamia, or Israel and Jordan, another issue we're not even covering today, but that is probably very worthy of much deeper discussion, or throughout different places in Africa. It's fine. But India is a perfect example. In the efforts to stop the Germans, the British had to rely very heavily on their foreign troops, both fighting Japan, on the border of Burma, Thailand, that sort of area, as well as fighting in the Middle East, as well as fighting in the Egyptian campaign, El Alamein, prominent amongst that, and including to some extent in the West. So India fought a lot for the British to help keep them alive. And after World War II, Britain wanted to maintain its empire. Churchill did. He ended up getting bounced from office. Attlee came to power, and what ended up happening was that India worked towards independence. And many of you will be familiar with Mahatma Gandhi and the nonviolence movement that happened. But Britain decided to do something sort of interesting at the end of the game. What they did was they allowed the Hindu areas to say, all right, every prince in an area who was in charge got to decide whether, as they broke up what was previously sometimes called Hindustan, was broke up into two entities. It was broke up into the Pakistan, that was the Muslim princes, and was broke up into India, which was the Hindu princes. And when you talk about the problems with Kashmir and Jammu, those provinces that are on the Pakistan-India border, it happened because you had populations where the prince was of one group and a large portion, and even a majority in some cases, were of the other group. So originally there was Pakistan and East Pakistan, which is what's modern-day Bangladesh, where there was a high Muslim population, because India had centuries of wars between Muslims and Hindus in terms of the people fighting. What ended up happening was India and Pakistan became rapidly opposed to one another, and they hate each other to this day. That's not news, and a lot of people will tell you that if you talk to them. They feel about each other like I don't know what would be a good example of how bad it is. It's probably one of the most violent cross-border relationships that exist in the world today, about mistrust and disliking one another. And they regularly, they actually both have undeclared nuclear powers against law, because each of them have tested nuclear weapons. And at this point, that is an ongoing issue. But I mention all this as preface to this so that as we get into the question of India, what you need to understand is that India went ahead. The United States was heavily involved with Arab powers. And because India broke away from Britain and had a hostile relationship to them, America was not attractive to India at that point in time. America actually had a pretty strong relationship against Russia with China and Pakistan, because China and Pakistan tend to work together because India is a threat to both of them. And so what ended up happening was India tried to do something called the Non-Aligned Pact, which BRICS and other things kind of came out of, which went one direction and tended to have quite good relationships with the Soviet Union and surprisingly poor relations with the United States. But after the Cold War ended, the first Cold War, I think we might call this the second Cold War, or I've called it the lukewarm war, although it's heating up, India recalibrated in the new world where things were defined differently, where China was now the center of let's call it what the second world was, which was the communist world. China was out there, and as their main competition, they share a large land border and they largely fight over manufacturing role. India ended up becoming more powerful in a lot of ways, has developed a lot, and has found that its issues have changed. India doesn't really have much of a relationship to go one way or another against Russia, and as Russia's come on board with China as part of an axis that's coming together there, China, the United States got pushed out of Pakistan, given a lot of the issues that fell out of the Afghan war. The United States and India have been pushed very heavily into bed with one another. And I think it's not an accident, as I've reported several times. The last trip Trump made before the whole COVID outbreak happened was he spent 3 days with Modi down in India. And we're going to talk a lot about that, because at this point, India now being the manufacturing power that could be used in lieu of China, having an interest to do so, and especially with this virus being a big source of hydroxychloroquine, being a big manufacturing source that could pick up a lot of that slack, and as a country that's getting hit pretty hard by COVID, is a country that has a lot of interest in the United States. Now, that effort is being even more pushed by the fact that China, taking advantage of India's worries about other issues around there, has gone ahead and made incredibly aggressive actions against India, which are the sort of things that could, in the wrong situation, actually lead to a war. And there's a very significant possibility, I would argue, that in fact China is going to maybe get into a war with India to some extent, and if that ends up happening, we may very well see that be the origin point. So we have flashpoints. Taiwan is a flashpoint. Hong Kong is a flashpoint. Korea is a flashpoint, but we don't talk about China and India as a flashpoint. So let's look what Anik Joshi has to say in foreign policy from this piece from yesterday. As Chinese soldiers rough up Indian ones along Pangong Lake and Ladakh along the two countries' disputed border, one thing is clear. While India and China have faced off in the region before, nobody knows what's coming next. India's friendship with China once seemed natural for a country that put socialist principles in its national constitution and prided itself on Cold War neutrality. It was unsurprising that India, under its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, I have a real hard time with Hindu names, I just apologize, I'm going to butcher some of these, it's the way it is, was interested in broadening ties with other newly created socialist nations, including China. But factors more powerful than ideological affiliation knocked the relationship off course, leading to an overlooked war and the tensions of today. At first, the relationship was all smiles and comradeship. In its early days, the Indo-Chinese relationship was supposedly based on 5 principles enunciated in the Panchil Agreement: mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. These principles, plus a shared belief in socialist economics, has led to a strong relationship. As the slogan went, Hindi Chini bye bye, India and China are brothers. In 1954, Nehru met Mao Zedong in Beijing, and the two leaders agreed on many issues, chiefly the need to remain strong against Western imperialism. Nehru had little love for the United States, despite being hosted by Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. And a lot of that had to do with being post-colonial generations who remember the response of Britain, who they had fought early in their lives. In the early days of the Cold War, he commented, "There is on the whole more reason on the side of Russia." Mao saw himself as continuing the anti-imperialist tradition of Chinese revolutionaries. But India and China disagreed on the border between the two nations, thanks in part to the legacy of uncertain colonial boundaries. The Ardagh-Johnson line was a border drawn by British India that placed Aksai Chin inside Jammu and Kashmir in India. China claimed to have never accepted this border, instead argued for the McCartney-MacDonald line, a later boundary that gave it more territory. The McMahon line, meanwhile, was named for a former foreign secretary with the British government in India, Henry McMahon, who signed an agreement in 1914 with Simla, with the then effectively independent Tibet, though China rejected this agreement. There were talks in India in April 1960 between Nehru and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai to address the border issues, but no solution. Keen to maintain a strategic barrier between the two nations, India kept funding resistance movements in Tibet and hosted the Dalai Lama when he fled. Tensions on the border continued to grow, and India and China continued to send forces into the region. In 1962, the idea of Indo-Chinese brotherhood died 14,000 feet above sea level when the two nations went to war. The Indian forces were overwhelmed as Nehru was caught off guard. China was able to breach Indian territory and later withdraw on its own terms. Yet China didn't see India as a permanent enemy. Mao once remarked that force would be able to knock Nehru to the negotiating table. The War of 1962 had domino effects that would be felt for years domestically after the fact. Future Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, then a young member of parliament, denounced Nehru's government for its failure, and even today the events of 1962 are broadly seen as humiliating domestically. But even more critical to understanding the India-China relationship may be the role of the Pakistan-China alliance. Initially, the United States was an important ally to Pakistan, and as a function of that, Pakistan and China weren't especially close. But that soon changed. As both Pakistan and China had border issues with India, common cause soon emerged. One of the most important events was the Bangladeshi War of Independence in 1971. China supported Pakistan in this war with both military aid and through millions of dollars in loans. And so I will say, Bangladesh, which is East Pakistan, sought, with the help of India, to be separate from Pakistan. Pakistan wanted to prevent its exclave, which is to say a part of the country that was not contiguously connected. Think of, what's a good example? Königsberg, or I should say Kaliningrad, that's in that Russian enclave between Poland and Lithuania. They used to be Königsberg in Prussia and Germany. As an example, it was a part of the country that was disconnected from the rest of the country. You could look at Alaska that way with respect to Canada, if you want an example that might be more familiar to you. But ultimately, India helped Bangladesh get away. India and Bangladesh get along pretty well, despite their ethnic tensions, and Pakistan's even more pissed at India. China supported Pakistan in this war with both military aid and through millions of dollars in loans. Though Pakistan lost the war to India in 1971, favors continued to flow both ways. China vetoed Bangladesh's effort to enter the UN until 1974. In addition, Pakistan offered support to the Chinese in the days after the Tiananmen Square massacre and has taken China's side on a number of key issues such as Taiwan and Tibet. Tibet. In recent years, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan and his predecessors have sought to deepen ties with China through initiatives like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, combined with Chinese funding for Gwadar Port and other economic initiatives. That has muted any Pakistani criticism of China's oppression of Muslims, such as the million-plus Uyghurs and other minorities sent to camps in Xinjiang. At the same time, Pakistani cooperation with the U.S. has crumbled under pressure. If there is a new Cold War, Pakistan has chosen a side. This, in turn, has helped strengthen the relationship between the United States and India, although there are also other factors at play. Since the 1990s, India has been slowly pushed ever closer to the West. In the early 1990s, India undertook incredibly ambitious economic reforms, more radical than those required by the IMF for desperately needed loans. The two key economic reforms dealt with conducting business in India and international commerce. Business in India between 1947 and the early 1990s was subject to the license Raj, the burdensome regulations needed to run even a small business. China, which had liberalized its economy to a degree in the 1980s, was storming ahead as a result. India choosing free markets was a sea change for the nation, demonstrating that the country was ready to move past failed economic policies, and a shift toward the Western American economic sphere soon followed. As India began to see high rates of growth, it became more of a viable competitor with China. This happened in tandem with India tightening relations with Chinese adversaries and American allies, such as Vietnam and Japan. Today, the United States remains important to the Indo-Chinese relationship. In recent times, India has sought to strengthen ties with Washington, partially powered by a fear of Chinese economic and political influence in the region, especially in ports and nearby oceans. As the Chinese get more aggressive in the Indian Ocean, India has been seeking an ally to bolster deterrence. Okay. 1 second here. And that piece is something we're going to talk about a lot. It's going to seem like I'm spending way too much time on it, but I'm really not. China going ahead and putting a military port, which is what India believes they're doing in Pakistan, represents an existential threat to Indian control of their own ocean space, and it's helping drive this, okay? And that's you could argue that's a function of the Belt and Road Initiative, but in the same way that you saw in a lot of ways the British military was developed in support of the British port system, or the American military to represent American commercial interests of a corporate structure after World War II, it's logical the Indians are concluding that the Chinese economic interest in the Belt and Road will be followed up in the future with Chinese force, and having China have a huge military on its northern border and a naval port now off the coast of Pakistan is an existential threat. And regardless of what happens with the United States, even if our country falls apart, India is going to make that conclusion. So Sino-Indian cooperation is going to lead to greater competition. And it's pretty predictable that the two biggest countries fighting for economic dominance on that continent might fight with one another as their systems diverge. So let's continue going forward here. Then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh signed a civilian nuclear deal with George W. Bush in the early 2000s. Barack Obama maintained close ties with New Delhi. Finally, the relationship between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and that between Modi and U.S. President Donald Trump, set up an interesting contrast. When Xi visited India in 2014, Modi allowed Tibetan exiles to protest, a luxury that had not been extended by previous governments in Delhi. When Trump visited this year, Modi greeted him with a rally in his home state attended by more than 100,000 people and viewed by nearly 50 million. China has responded to this by further strengthening ties with Pakistan. Beijing and Islamabad have joined efforts against both locusts and the coronavirus pandemic. China has donated both products like masks and expertise in managing the fallout from the twin crises. Meanwhile, defense ties between the United States and India have only grown. 2019 featured the first land, sea, and air exercise in the history of Indo-American relations. This was in many ways a continuation of the policy pursued by the Bush and Obama administrations, both of which saw India as a partner in the pivot to Asia and tried to move closer through areas like arms sales. Border issues may be the focus of Sino-Indian conflict today, from the near clash in Doklam in 2017 to today's standoff. But the geopolitical tensions and alignments involved are much bigger. India's growingly comfortable relationship with the West heralds a clear choice in any global conflict. We're a long way from Hindi, Chini, bye-bye. So what does that mean? India is going to be against China in how things shake out. And that controls how a lot of other pieces shake out, because this is just a very simple domino effect, right? So the U.S., you're going to see Pakistan side with China as things go forward, and India with the U.S., and then you look at how these different pieces go forward. But let's go ahead and put some color into this. So that was a very broad thing. This is what India's really worried about in the moment. Although I will say, there's another piece here that I think I would highly recommend you read. It would take me an hour to read to you. I'm not going to do for you today because it would just be too long. It's not an hour. It would take maybe 20 minutes, but it's really heavily technical and it's for people who understand. But I have a piece here. Here's why all's not well for India on the Ladakh front. The Chinese have created new facts on the ground and pushed the Indian political leadership to react in ways that will further disadvantage the Indian military. This was published just a few hours ago by Pravin Sawi, and I think it's worth taking a look at it. It really goes into the details of the cross-border crisis between India and China, and the fact that India now sees China occupying some of their territory. That is one part of the crisis, and that has been an ongoing sore spot. Here's the second part of that, and we're going to grab this from the Quint. This is ultimately this comes from Bloomberg. This was published on June 8th by Kodab Singh. China's high-security compound at Gwadar. Should India worry? Recent reports indicate that China is building several new high-security complexes at the Gwadar deep sea port at the western end of Pakistan's coastline in Balochistan. So that's right at the intersection between Iran and Pakistan, just so you have an idea of the geography. And Iran is a country that theoretically would be working with China. And in fact, you see China and Russia right now are trying to stop additional sanctions against Iran. Iran needs a place to dump their oil, and what better way to do it? You don't have to put it on the sea. If it comes through Pakistan, it can come through a pipeline right through there. And that's where you would have natural gas and whatnot help support that regime. So you would expect Iran, Pakistan, and China to be working together. Earlier in March 2017, Chinese military sources had spoken about deploying Navy Marines at Gwadar and Djibouti to defend Chinese interests overseas. When viewed alongside China's overall activities in the Indian Ocean, it does seem that Beijing is likely using Gwadar as a dual-use economic hub-cum-military base. China had first evinced interest in Gwadar in 2001 as the endpoint of a trade corridor connecting Kashgar or Xinjiang to the Arabian Sea through the Karakoram Highway. The aim was to drastically reduce the trade transit costs and time between its northwestern regions and markets in the Middle East and Africa. China completed the initial development of Gwadar port in 2006 and at the same year signed an agreement with Pakistan to upgrade the Karakoram Highway. So to put this in the broad strategic sense, if you want to think of it historically, in the same way that America has used the Navy to control the way the world works and allow free trade of commerce, what China's trying to do is change the way the world works by making land transport once again cheaper than sea transport, and by the Belt and Road Initiative to go ahead and take away the economic incentives and all the cultural imperial models that follow from it to a railway-based model. This is not without precedent in history. This is kind of, frankly, what Germany tried to do in Europe to remove British hegemony, and it led to a number of the different fights of what happened, that the role of railways really moved the power away from the British-French imperial powers to the German giant for about 80 years before Germany was so destroyed that it didn't have the ability to exist, which is what World War II, in a broader strategic sense beyond the ideology, was about. You have to begin to understand these larger economic interests and how they play together. America basically represents the biggest island in the world. China represents the effort of the world island, as it's seen, and this is how they refer to it in geopolitics, to come together as a single entity to have hegemony against that or have some larger role. And of course, they're going to go against one another. And when you look at the U.S.'s two most important allies, probably in the world today, Britain and Japan, you see that they're basically the unsinkable aircraft carriers of the island that is the United States across the ocean. So if you understand all this, and you understand this from a geostrategic perspective, you can see how China is trying to make it so they just have short hops across easy ponds and have it where they don't have to even do that when they can go forward. And that's why a relationship between a China-Russia axis is really interesting, because what it does is it gives Europe a different way to pivot as either a third force that's neutral and non-aligned like India was in the original Cold War, which will be very appealing to the Germans and French, to be honest with you, or alternatively as maybe a fully engaged entity in that. Conversely, the Anglosphere is not going to want any piece of that, but this is the world that's evolving that you should see in the days ahead, regardless of what happens in the individual actions. And as we see countries renationalize, having the ability to have more control of what comes in and out, you're going to see authoritarian models be more effective. And in a lot of ways, the Chinese model is going to be much more appealing than the American model, which I think in this challenge will come to reflect, regardless of who wins, something that looks much more like what China's provoking right now. Anyway, let's continue. The 20-point statement on April 2015 pledged to make the CPE, this should be here. In January 2013, Pakistan gave control of Gwadar port to a Chinese company, and 4 months later, China proposed the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor as a trade transit corridor between Pakistan's coastal areas and China's Xinjiang. The 20-point joint statement of April 2015 pledged to make the CPEC an important project of the Belt and Road Initiative, with Beijing investing substantially in infrastructure, power generation, and dams. Gwadar Port and the Karakoram Highway upgradation were thus subsumed under the CPEC project. Both Pakistan and China visualized turning the GDSP into a regional trade hub by 2023. But an economic issue turned into a military problem. China's export-oriented economy is critically dependent on unfettered movement of resources and goods across seas. But with its maritime traffic through the Indian Ocean vulnerable to interdiction, and by that they mean the U.S. stopping it, the economic issue has turned into a military program, compelling China to look for, 1, overland routes for resource access and trade. The BRI, CPC, and its oil gas pipelines are examples of that. And the BRI means the Belt and Road Initiative. That's how they're trying to get into Russia and Europe. Opportunities to deploy its navy in the Indian Ocean, and a base to servicing its naval elements. Because remember, China needs to sell stuff. They can sell stuff to Europe. Europe can sell luxury goods to them, and that could be an alternate model. And, people say, oh, well, we've been allies forever. Look, no alliances are permanent. How many times have Germany and France fought each other? Geez, how many times have Britain and France fought each other? These things happen. Kissinger was right about one thing. Countries have permanent interests, not permanent alliances. And don't let the fact that things are written in law, that's the one thing a lot of Americans just don't understand. Laws are only worth the intention and quality of them. We all break laws all the time because if they don't have meaning to us, we ignore them and pick which ones you like, right? So, China's naval development plan, laid out by Admiral Lu Huquang in the 1980s, has envisioned its navy venturing into the Indian Ocean from 2010 onwards to first gathering operating information, then entering in strength by 2020. And you remember, China's invested a lot of money in East Africa. They're doing a lot of resource extraction there, and China can think in terms of 5 and 10-year plans, and they're acting on them. So how does that fit into a larger scenario? We have to figure that out. The UN resolutions of 2008 on piracy provided China a perfect cover to establish a naval presence in the Indian Ocean without adverse international fallout. January 2009 saw the development of the PLA Navy's anti-piracy task force off the coast of Somalia. This task force continues to maintain a presence there. And remember, that's the U.S.'s traditional function. They've claimed that as an excuse, a pretext to be involved. It does help American corporations, but China wants to keep the trade going just in a different direction. Further, from February 2014, China's nuclear-powered and conventional submarines also commenced sorties into the Indian Ocean, which stops at Karachi or Colombo, that's in Sri Lanka, en route. China's assistance to Pakistan in the construction of a very low-frequency facility at Turbet, north of Gwadar, for communications with strategic submarines assumes significance in this context. China's quest for a naval base in the Indian Ocean. China does need some sort of permanent basing to sustain its operations in the Indian Ocean, especially with India objecting to PLA submarines docking at Colombo. Its first military base on foreign soil at Djibouti, established in 2017, is, however, adjacent to the bases of 7 foreign militaries, including the U.S. Hence, it serves only as a logistical facility for operations associated with anti-piracy, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. There have thus been conjecture about China establishing a military base in countries where it has developed port infrastructure under its, quote, string of pearls, which is Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the Maldives. These conjectures, however, directly extrapolate the U.S. model of military basing. The powerful U.S. military has the bandwidth to defend its bases worldwide, whereas the PLA Navy does not yet have such force structure. Besides, in India's neighborhood, where the Indian military operating off the Indian landmass holds this home advantage. In the absence of this capability, China needs a country that is a strategic ally, inimical to India, has a strong military, and contribute to the defense of the Chinese base. Pakistan, a client state in Gwadar, located at the furthest end of Pakistan, fit this requirement ideally. So, next point, presence of Chinese assets at Pakistani ports could inhibit Indian plans. And look, this is very technical, but you need the facts to understand the world, and I'm doing that because this is what we do, I think, really well in this program, and I have some people really give us credit for it. We give you the understanding for why things are happening the way they are. Once you understand the interests, even if people don't want to do certain things, this is how this is how these sort of problems happen, you just got to see the pieces being put into play, and you'll know what the outcomes are going to be. Cause and effect, right? A 2014 analysis by the U.S. National Defense University highlighted Chinese overseas basing requirements in the 21st century and highlighted that dual-use logistics facilities best suit Chinese policies, with trusted ally Pakistan being the ideal location for a military base. Gwadar fully fits this description. This analysis is backed by Chinese commentaries on establishment of overseas strategic support bases, which espouse a fully functional base in Pakistan. A Chinese naval base at Gwadar will increase India's operational dilemma. So India's perspective is, do they want to just sit back and watch China do this? Do they have a choice? And as you see more people look at the question of how China represents, the dragon represents a giant that's growing, the idea to push back against it. The U.S. military Pentagon study saying that 10 years from now, America won't be able to fight as well, and the suspicion from big elements that's being pushed by media in the U.S., which may or may not be true, that China is heavily behind the destabilizing protests in the U.S. in terms of at least providing financial and moral support, lead to where people fight one another, because this is how a war comes into being and how these reinforce one another, okay? Continuing the article, China will have a readily available naval force in the Indian Ocean, albeit small size. The presence of Chinese assets at Pakistani forces could inhibit Indian plans, just as U.S. military presence at Pakistani bases post 9/11 had complicated its plans after the 13th December 2001 attack on our parliament. Gwadar Port, a commercial venture or a colonizing one? A Chinese naval presence at Gwadar, which is located at the mouth of the Gulf of Oman, will also allow to A, monitor ship traffic from the Persian Gulf, as well as the movement of the U.S. Navy Fifth Fleet, part of the U.S. Central Command, headquartered in Bahrain. And remember, Bahrain is a Sunni country with a Shia country with a Sunni king that has had to use incredible force to keep its own people under restriction. And B, protect its own maritime traffic while being in position to interdict similar vessels of adversaries. Gwadar Port has witnessed sparse maritime traffic since opening in 2007, while China continues to plug it as a commercial venture, is increasingly looking like a coaling station like the British built in their colonization ventures, with China already maintaining an average of 6 to 7 naval ships in the Indian Ocean, and its media hinting at the deployment of an aircraft carrier in the near future. It does seem that China is gearing up to use Gwadar also as a military base in the times to come. So India does not like that. India hates the idea of having them there because they can see that they're an enemy. They're getting stronger. They're working with their own existential enemy, Pakistan. And India and Pakistan ever getting along again, that's a religious war. That's not going away. So you begin to understand that. But as India gets drawn into the U.S. and China goes ahead and pushes against them, there is other things happening. And we have to look how other actors are out there. So for our many friends in the Southern Hemisphere and for our friends in Australia, we go now to the Sydney Morning Herald for a piece that was written on June 9th by Peter Harcher, political and international editor for the Sydney Morning Herald. An opinion piece that indicates, and I will say as pretext to this, preface to this, that India and Australia just had a conversation where they had a wide-ranging agreement on Indian Ocean navigation support for economic development between the two countries, and a broadly and quickly deepening alliance between India and Australia in opposition, frankly, to China, as China shut Australia out from sending key exports to China, and now the domestic market in India is opening up to Australia as an alternative. So what we see here, before I even get into this piece, is a redrawing of lines where goods and services don't move so easily past, and you are seeing a bipolar world where in Asia, at least, let's leave the U.S. out of this, that if India is the pivot against China, you see India working with Australia and also with Vietnam, Thailand, and Japan. There's a 4-point structure there that's looking at it. Korea's a bit more complicated, and Taiwan's a problem for everybody. But on the other hand, you see China, Pakistan, you see Iran as part of a growing axis of linked foreign land powers, and then Russia's the big question mark. We'll get to them last. So this piece, June 9th, 2020. Vladimir Lenin once remarked, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. As the leader of the Russian Revolution, he was a bit of an expert on sudden upheavals following long stasis. We are living through such weeks now. In the past week, 3 important developments continued to accelerate the change to Australia's place in the world. First, the Chinese government told Chinese citizens do not travel to Australia. It is unsafe in Australia because of racist violence against Chinese people, according to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Weaponized arguments of racism, by the way, are China's favorite way to attack people in their countries. They do it internationally, but doesn't that sound a hell of a lot like a message you've been hearing all throughout the media in the United States? Is it true? Is it not true? Well, the best accusations often have an element of truth in them, and I think that that's fair to say. But conversely, the person who's making the accusations ought to be a little careful with that, because the way the Han Chinese have treated the Tibetan people, have treated the Uyghurs out in the western part of their country, is nothing sort of genocidal, where they've literally taken Uyghurs and harvested organs. But you will never hear anyone in the media really make a big stink about the horrible things that happen to them. Why? Because they're ideological allies. And that's where the intersection of national politics and ideology happens in ways that makes everyone into a hypocrite. And that's the problem why nations ultimately can't exist where they have dependent, or they have, ideologies so opposed to one another they can't coexist. That's what's breaking America. And eventually America will go one way or the other. We'll see what happens. But I present this because I want you to see the similarities and how this intersects into the global problem we're having that's emergent in the United States at present, and that the coronavirus, which came out of China, so exacerbated, and which was actually allowed to continue and then pushed aside to go ahead and build this conflict on top of it. You could almost conclude, and I know a lot of people do, including myself, but I know a lot of my audience won't be ready to go that far. In fact, the media is a helpful entity to the sort of ability to deconstruct the whole American system. But if you go to a far enough left-wing college, you would understand that. But let's continue. At the moment, it's academic. The border is closed, but it's smarter for Beijing to do it this way. Let the tension build. Now the announcement has been made. The fear in the affected industries will amount in anticipation. The tourism and university sectors will pressure the Morrison government to crack. The travel threat is the third installment in this year's of economic coercion against Australia. The others were actions against Australia's barley exports to China, then beef. Beijing is trying to build a constituency of Australian economic interests, one after another, that will clamor for Canberra to capitulate and give China whatever it wants. So what you see is that China is working in such a way where they are basically using a combination of cultural and economic attacks to destabilize the government of Australia. Scott Morrison, who's a Tory down there, conservative, to go ahead and support the move in a political change to help a certain party get the power at the same time that they help other parties that are more sympathetic to them. This is not uncommon. A lot of countries do this, but China's being particularly blatant about it. So when you see all the things getting pushed in America in the same sort of way, I want you to see the parallel that exists here in Australia, coming here from the Sydney Morning Herald. Australia's tourism and education systems exports to China were worth a combined $23 billion last year, about 10 times the value of the affected barley and beef. More pain is planned, as helpfully set out by Beijing's ambassador to Canberra, Chen Jingyi, on April 27th. He also had Australian wine on his list. This was reinforced over the weekend with a Communist Party boombox, the Global Times, saying the damage to Australia announced so far is only the tip of the iceberg of what's to come. And it will continue until one of two things happen. Either Australia surrenders and becomes a vassal to China, or proves it can withstand the pain and retains its sovereignty. Morrison has held firm so far. The second development was the news that Donald Trump is ordering the withdrawal of some of the U.S. troops based in Germany. This is consistent with his long-held disdain for U.S. allies. The Trump administration didn't bother to consult Germany over the move or America's other European allies. The United States has maintained bases in Germany since World War II as part of the NATO alliance. The alliance was initially to deter any Soviet-Russian attack on Western Europe. In recent years, it's to deter any attack by Vladimir Putin's Russia. The Wall Street Journal broke the story that the U.S. would pull out about a quarter of its 34,000 troops. And I should say a lot of the Germans wanted to see this happen, and the relationship between the U.S. and Germany is souring deeply and quickly. Merkel was actually invited to a G7 meeting, which she didn't want to attend, but at the same time, interestingly, India, South Korea, and Australia were being invited, as well as Russia, to attend. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but that is interesting. You see the alliances are beginning to shift, and they're moving away from the old way of looking at things to maybe a different alignment. And I think that we may see this happen very unpredictably and very quickly. Look for where the economic interest and the sovereignty of nations goes to see who will side with who. Anyway, continuing, the plans show once again that the Trump administration neglects an elementary leadership task, the involvement of allies in decision-making processes, said the deputy leader of Chancellor Angela Merkel's conservative bloc, Johann Weidepol. All benefit from the cohesion alliance, only Russia and China from discord. He's right. Putin works hard to undermine NATO and sow division. He wants more Russian sway over Europe, and Trump seems content to let him have it. But Trump has a legitimate complaint about America's NATO allies in Europe. Most of them haven't met their long-standing promise to increase defense spending to the equivalent of 2% of GDP. They are vulnerable to the charge of preloading on America. In a moment of peak on 2017, Trump refused to commit to honoring the treaty in the event of an attack on Europe. He has since recanted. Nonetheless, Trump's continuing insults to America's treaty partners are among the many flashing red lights warning that the U.S. under Trump is an unreliable ally. And it's let me pull this out for a little bit. So this is the intersection between nationalism and ideology. On the one hand, most European governments and central government look at things from, even though they have nominal democracy, they actually believe in authoritarian structures that are internationalist and institutionalist, like the European Union, which Germany and France very much believe in, despite the fact their people don't. And on the other hand, you have nationalist forces rising, people like Trump's, or, let's pick example, Trump, Modi, you could argue to a lesser extent, Boris Johnson, benefiting from the Brexit movement, that represent different way of looking at things. And so you see ideologies reforming in new ways to connect with economic interests, and that relationship, which goes both ways, is pulling things apart. The U.S. being involved in Europe is a little bit weird, and it's a historical thing that comes out of World War II. The renormalization of Europe as being an independent entity, with Germany and France at the center of it, is something you would expect, and that's actually happening here. And what I would expect to see in the short term is a third way position that they will take between trying to pivot between the China bloc and the U.S. bloc, and then they'll make the decision what's more in their interest. And I suspect the Chinese will give them more carrots, and that eventually you will see that sort of will normalize. And then that might lead to a really, really weird situation where Russia, in fact, being surrounded by a Europe that has a lot of money, China that has a lot of forces and not knowing where to go, might become friendly with the U.S. again. These things happen, and the U.S. and Russia are actually natural geographic allies. But we'll see what happens. And people don't think that way, because we think in the West in terms of geopolitics as being something of just, we believe this. We have a very idealistic view of politics. Real world politics doesn't work that way. It's in fact the opposite of idealism. And so when you see things change and you get whiplash as you're moved one way or another, understand it's because your ideas matter far less than where the larger economic interests go, because ultimately money talks and bullshit walks. And that's what we're having. So between money and hard power, which is the use of force to have control, we're going back to that world. And that world has been the world we've had most of the time. It's something we escaped for a very short time that will probably be known as the Pax Americana, and now we go back to the usual anarchy between different states, and we'll have zones of control. And where will they be around? The United States will have one, Europe will have one, Russia will have one, India will have one, China will have one, and how they pivot against one another, just like we did in the Civil War episode with the United States. California, Texas, Illinois, New York, and Florida. Those are your centers of power in the United States, where things will probably form around or in opposition to. And then they'll have support against or for them. If we ended up splitting, I'm just using that as an example, as an economic model, not necessarily a military one, but I want you to see how this is working in this Australian piece, and I want you to see for our Australian friends over there that really China's trying to go ahead and coerce you into support, and of course, in response to that, Australia is looking for who they can connect more to. So what does that mean? That means closer relationships with India and the United States, and ultimately that will be used as the political fight that's out there. So in the same way that in America you're used to the left blames everything on Russia and the right blames everything on China, this will go forward, where in fact they're all trying to destabilize it, because on the one hand they have ideological allies, but a destabilized country that's taken off the table, better than having an ally or an enemy is having a non-entity, and this is the tension that's in geopolitics. Okay, so let's continue. The third development was Australia's summit with India on Thursday. Scott Morrison's virtual meeting with his Indian counterpart, Narendra Modi, was notable. The India-Australia relationship has always been one of polite but hollow formalities. That's starting to change. The two leaders are now building substance. Among the 9 agreements they signed was one to allow reciprocal access to each other's military bases for logistics support, such as refueling and maintenance. This will enable closer military exercises and training. Another was a maritime cooperation agreement. Without once mentioning China, Foreign Affairs Minister Maurice Payne found 3 different ways of saying this is all about China. The agreement, she said, commits our nations to supporting the rules-based maritime order in the region, founded on respect for the sovereignty of all nations and international law, particularly the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Why did I spend so much time talking about that port in Pakistan? Because everyone's looking at that as a game changer. That convention was the one Beijing violated by seizing marine territory claimed by the Philippines, according to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. Morrison and Modi signed another agreement to cooperate on critical cyber and other technologies. In other words, they don't want things being stolen from them, which China has done very many times to catch up, and that countries do regularly to one another. And without mentioning China, Modi also found a bunch of ways to say that this is, quote, all about China. He repeatedly stressed the importance of values. Given that we share democratic values, Modi told Morrison, it is our sacred responsibility to uphold and protect values for global good like democracy, rule of law, freedom, mutual respect, regard for international institutions, and transparency. Those values were under challenge. Why is India committing more strongly than ever to its Australia relationship? Like Australia, India is under increasing pressure from Beijing. For the past month, India's troops have been in a standoff against China's at a hotspot along their 4,000-kilometer border in a flare-up of long-standing dispute. China's increasing intrusions into the Indian Ocean and its advances with its Belt and Road projects on all sides have spurred Delhi to compete with Beijing to protect its sphere of influence. A leading Indian analyst, C. Raja Mohan, explains Modi's situation. As he copes with China's rise and hedges against U.S. unpredictability, the Indian Prime Minister is also eager to develop stronger ties with other middle powers like France, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Australia. In other words, India's situation has strong similarities to Australia's. Feeling threatened by China, unable to rely on the U.S., it is turning to find new partners in the region to protect its interests. And all three of these trends have demonstrated strikingly in a single week as history rushes onwards, accelerated by the pandemic. Geopolitics has gone viral. It's a great ending, great piece written by Mr. Archer. And what I would say is there are a lot of countries out there that are worried the U.S. is not going to hold up. They can see what's happening to the U.S. On the one hand, they would love to have the U.S. be a bulwark against China. On the other hand, they're worried that the U.S. won't make it. And I don't blame them. I think the U.S. is going to have a really hard time making it. I personally don't think we're going to. And I know I'm very somber in that. And people say, oh, you don't understand this. I understand. Believe me, I understand a lot more than you think I understand. I've been knee-deep in this stuff for years. I've been in the trenches of politics for 15 years. And I can tell you the sort of things that are incredibly destabilizing. But America literally has no authority that can pull it back together. The military, which could, doesn't want to get involved. So the military, which is the last institution that had the power and authority to pull America back together, says, no, we're not touching this. So what's going to happen is eventually the military will be dragged into the same conflict. And people aren't ready to believe that. They say, hey, it's just a little fight. It's a protest. Are you upset? Are you a racist? You don't have to be a racist to see that half of America opposing the other half of America has been a problem going way back. It was a problem in 2008. It was a problem in 2000. It's been a problem of a country that doesn't know what we're about. And why did that happen? Because our culture was taken over by people who basically said our country is a bad place. And now you have the fight between, ultimately, whoever's right and wrong. People say America's good and people say America's bad. And when you have that dualistic worldview, that is how you lose a war. That is the decadence and the corruption that is the death of every empire, where everyone's rich enough to ignore the problem, and now all that's left is the ability for one side to fight the other and to impose control over the other. When you understand the deep darkness at the heart of the American problem beyond the different issues people have, because honestly, if we're going to be blunt about it, the protesters have a point, the people who hate the protesters have a point, and we could sit down and have a conversation about those points if we could talk with one another, but it's really hard when all we do is scream at one another. And I'll be honest, I'm tempted to scream as much as anyone. I lean a certain way. Y'all know that. That's not a secret. But it's really hard because what people want is solutions. I don't know that there's a stable outcome to this, and the fact that we let it get to the point where we disagree about such things is really the mark of generations of political propaganda efforts, not just from China, but to go back to the old KGB. If you've never seen the 1991 video from KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov, where the Soviet Union invested 30, 40 years of effort into the universities to get the West to hate itself, and as you see these riots happen in these protests in countries where, frankly, they don't even have many minorities, they are supposedly in support of Black Lives Matter, and that you see the big money behind it, the sort of capitalist, communist, the capitalism, socialism, like false duality, where ultimately you see these are both secular, humanist philosophies, that ultimately those disagreements are unbridgeable in a lot of ways, and that these were deliberately provoked. And so we have to deal with that. And I'm not saying the questions aren't legitimate. What I'm saying is it may not matter, because ultimately in the game of geopolitics, what you want to do is take people off the table. And there's a lot of people, our allies are worried the U.S. will be taken off the table. Our enemies are trying to take the U.S. off the table, and the Americans are all fighting one another. And as we fight one another, just like we saw in the American Revolution, expect in the future to see people try to get funding from people who they think will be friendly to them. And interestingly, don't be surprised if Russia funds the left and the right and China funds the left and the right, because you know what? Even though they have three different choices, their worst case scenario is they face a regime that is strong and hostile to them. Their second best scenario is that they're facing a regime that's friendly to them that will support and allow them to do what they want. But their very best scenario is an America that's broken irreparably, because then they can do whatever they want and they don't have to care, and they can destabilize and treat this as they would other powers did. If you don't believe that happens, Roman Empire was the heart of Europe for 1,000 years, right? And then, Italy was picked apart by every state, France, Spain, Germany, because it had the inability to come together. Those are the dangers of balkanization. The upside of it is we might be happier where we live. And, are there different ways we can get to that? That's a conversation we should have, but we can't have it because right now we're busy shutting down everyone who offends our sensibilities because they're evil, bad people. And that's okay. I mean, that 43% they talked about America, 71% of Republicans who think using the military is a good idea, you can shut them down and you can beat them in an election. You could probably beat them in a landslide, 55-45. But the bad news is now you've gone ahead and created a half of a country that hates your guts and wants to fight. That's America in the future. So now that we're looking at that, let's look at Japan. And, I didn't mention Japan because the Japan-America Security Alliance has been at the heart of things for a very long time in our ability to contain things. And Japan and China have long, deep acrimony going to the events of World War II and the many atrocities, quite frankly, Japan committed against China. Nonetheless, Japan, who you'd expect to be the most vigorous ally and who is building its own self-defense force, has been absent or has been noticeable through its absence. And I want to share this piece from Japan Times because it looks like Japan is saying, the world is getting different. Maybe we should be careful for ourselves. Japan threads the needle as U.S.-China animosity hits new highs. This piece was written yesterday, I believe, by Satoshi Sugiyama and Jesse Johnson. When it comes to increasingly fraught U.S.-China relations, Japan is facing a be careful what you wish for moment. Tokyo, which has long pushed the U.S. to take a tougher stance against an aggressive China, is now finding itself caught in the middle as the two superpowers duke it out in the economic and security spheres and over the response to the coronavirus. But regardless of the results of this fight, from which a clear winner is unlikely to emerge anytime soon, if at all, Japan must thread the needle with both countries, something Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has already proven successful at doing. Quoting Xi. In his annual speech before the Diet in January, Abe emphasized that the two Asian powers share large responsibilities for peace and prosperity in the region and world and vowed to build a new era of mature Japan-China relations. The remarks came after years of growing tensions and bickering between Tokyo and Beijing, mainly about lingering historical issues and concerns over Chinese moves near disputed islands. Over the last year or so, the relationship has steadily improved. Abe had been eager to use a planned April state visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping to cement a new forward-looking relationship with the world's second-largest economy. But then a mysterious and deadly strain of coronavirus began to spread rapidly across the globe from the Chinese city of Wuhan. Japan was forced to confront the virus after scores of passengers and crew members aboard the Diamond Princess cruise ship tested positive for COVID. At roughly the same time, the government dispatched charter flights to repatriate Japanese citizens trapped in Wuhan. And let's remember, Japan, even though they looked at the beginning, they were going to get hard, they've been very lucky, and they haven't been. Why they haven't been has been the source of intense speculation, and we don't really know the answer. We've talked about the possibility that they got an earlier strain that's provided some degree of immunity. We talked about the role of masks. We talked about the role of social distancing. And maybe there was something that went on beyond the scenes we haven't talked about that we can't know about. That's possible. It is a strange and anomalous data point that in a world gone mad, Japan is operating in a third way sort of way of thinking, where they're trying to pivot between the U.S. and China, where in fact you would expect them to do the opposite. Why that should be the case? Is it because of military weakness? Is it because of economic dependency? Is it because Japan thinks America's in trouble? Who knows? But obviously Japan is trying to hedge its bets. But with the threat of a devastating economic blow on the horizon, and with a once-in-a-decade state visit by a Chinese leader at stake, Abe appeared reluctant to take sweeping steps to ban visitors from China like the U.S. and Australia did, disregarding calls from both hardline conservative lawmakers and opposition parties. Although China suspended all group tours in late January, Japan continued to permit entry to individual tourists. Later, the government limited travel from the two provinces declared to be virus hotspots. All visitors from China were ultimately banned in early April. Abe denied that Xi's planned state visit had clouded his judgment to quickly ban entry to Chinese visitors. In early March, Xi postponed his trip, and it remains uncertain if it will happen this year or at all, considering growing opposition over Beijing's crackdown in Hong Kong. Excuse me, on hiccups. With tourist numbers tanking and factory operations suspended, the COVID pandemic has exposed one of Japan's blind spots: over-dependence on China. Before the pandemic engulfed the world and sapped international travel, visitors from China comprised almost 35% of tourists to Japan. Close to 925,000 arrived in Japan alone, in January alone, according to Japan National Tourism Organization data. The figure plummeted to just 10,400 in March and a mere 200 in April after the travel ban went into effect. While the nation's foreign direct investment in China was about 7.6 trillion yen, or $70 billion US dollars in the first 6 months of 2019, the government in April earmarked in its supplementary budget roughly 243.5 billion yen to assist Japanese firms in relocating their operations out of China. The funds were to help either bring those operations back to Japan or relocate them elsewhere. But finding an alternative to China is no simple task, said Amy King, a specialist in Sino-Japanese relationships at the Australian National University in Canberra. From what I've seen in Japan's case, a lot of the actual firms are resisting some of the efforts to diversify away from China because there are simply not very good alternatives, King said. And it's actually harder than ever right now to open up a new manufacturing plant in Bangladesh or Vietnam. And it's kind of interesting to see this, that if Japan and China might decide to make a pragmatic, alliance in a lot of ways. And to use an example of this, the Soviet Union didn't go to war with Japan until 1945. It's something worth remembering. These things happen. Concerns about Beijing may also turn out to be less vexing, or at least more predictable, than dealing with the United States as the administration of President Trump contends with the volatile situation there. Trump, in a double-barreled challenge to his presidency, is facing down nationwide protests over systemic racism and police brutality, while also battling scathing criticism over his administration's handling of the coronavirus, which has killed more than 110,000 Americans. Looking to deflect some of the anger over these events as his campaign hits full stride ahead of the November election, Trump has unleashed his administration to mount some of the strongest attacks by the U.S. against the Communist Party-ruled China in recent memory. These attacks and measures have not been confined to mere rhetoric. From Hong Kong to the South China Sea to Beijing's coronavirus and its Phase 1 trade deal with the U.S., the White House has been ramping up pressure on the trade, security, and diplomatic fronts. Beijing, far from backing down, has also bolstered its campaign against Washington, slamming its credibility as a beacon of freedom and looking to take advantage of the current turmoil. Amid the strife, Abe has spoken obliquely of a larger global role for Japan in building a new international order, while signaling that the country will cooperate with other nations to share the basic universal values of freedom, democracy, basic human rights, and the rule of law. While experts have said these kinds of remarks are undoubtedly aimed at Beijing, they have also warned they could come back to haunt Abe. There's no doubt these comments are targeted at China, said Yuki Tatsumi, co-director of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center think tank in Washington. But I would say when it comes to China, I think Japan is in the middle of a be careful what you wish for a moment. Tatsumi said Japan has long been frustrated with the lack of urgency in Washington toward Chinese assertiveness and had long hoped it would come out as more explicitly critical of China's problematic behavior. But now that the Trump administration has been demonstrating in no uncertain terms its hardline stance toward China, Japan is feeling anxious whether it can align itself with Washington all the way. She said, adding that this dilemma was likely to only grow as the talk of decoupling with Chinese supply chains continues and the U.S. weighs on allies with Tokyo. So this is interesting, right? Japan's going to have to pick a side, and they are kind of playing the role of tweeners, right? Because not only you have to remember, do they have to deal with China, but they have to deal with Russia. They are being right near their waters as well. So this is more complicated. And if the U.S. looks like weakness, all of a sudden, Japan's best strategy may be collaborative rather than being in the front line against it. Remember, India's got a gigantic army and a huge population that they can go ahead and offer space with. Australia's pretty far away, so they have a whole situation between them where the Navy's not right there. Japan, on the other hand, is pretty damn close to China, and that's where this problem goes. Their economy is heavily linked in that, and they don't have time to pull out. So would they want to try to buy for time by going between the sides as long as they can? Yeah, because Abe, in his efforts to go ahead and remilitarize Japan, which I think they would want to do and have an independent path, ultimately, that links with the less threatening of whatever powers is around, which to them is the United States being on the other side, they will go ahead and maybe they may have to act differently because of the fact that weakness forces them into arrangements, and arrangements that often start out as efforts of convenience, like the U.S. and India, as we can see, can develop in certain ways, or Australia and India, which is becoming much bigger, despite having kind of lingered for years as just sort of like out there. Anyway, Abe's ace in the hole. Sandwiched between two global superpowers at each other's throats, Abe has seized on the tumult as a blessing in disguise to allow him to flex his muscles in one of his strongest suits, diplomacy. Asked at a May 25th news conference which country he would side with amid the acrimony, U.S. or China, Abe avoided a straight answer but instead offered a carefully worded assessment saying that Japan would maintain ties to both countries irrespective of the rising tensions. And that's actually going to be something that, I think China will be okay with, but the U.S. won't be. And that is going to maybe push Japan toward eventually the Chinese camp. And, they might say, hey, we'll demilitarize. And if America has to move its troops out of Japan or Okinawa, that opens the door for China to go into Taiwan. And I would not be surprised if China, seeing this opening, throws a lot of money at it, and you might see a major change in this. And then America will probably act more militant. And you begin to see how these problems can play out. And then, India will even get more scared. And then as countries feel scared of losing their status because they're losing allies, that's when wars can happen. Abe reiterated the importance of Japan's alliance with the U.S., but also stressed the importance of further incorporating China into the global rule-making process. Beyond his dealings with the fraught Sino-U.S. relationship, Abe also appears to be forging his own path. Late last month, he spoke with European Council Chief Charles Michel and European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen via video conference, a hopeful indication that diplomacy, hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic, was re-emerging in interest. The talks effectively served to reassure mutual support of multilateralism in solidarity despite the growing U.S.-China animosity. What remains unclear is what Tokyo is willing to do if Washington or Beijing take aim at the multilateral groupings Japan has painstakingly helped to cultivate. Already, the Abe cabinet has navigated around U.S. retrenchment, but it has also taken on Chinese ambitions via coalition building within existing frameworks, said Sheila Smith, senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington. What happens when either China or the U.S. breaks one of these frameworks remains to be seen. Regardless, she said, Tokyo has a long history of building such partnerships as it pursues its interests. We should expect it to continue or even become more necessary as the U.S. and China deepen their antagonism. So sort of like Austria played a role between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, perhaps. In the meantime, Japan certainly has areas where it can step up to the plate, like in maritime security, public health, rulemaking and investment, technology and data sharing. Australian National University's King said, still Japan cannot independently exercise its leadership. It must choose to work cooperatively with China or compete with it. I absolutely do think Japan does have the capacity to play a more important role, but I guess the caveat is whatever role Japan plays in the region, it will need to choose how it relates to China and the United States, King said. In particular, it looks like the United States looks increasingly like it may pull out of the regional and global order to some extent altogether, but China is very much active in trying to shape an order in the region. So whatever role Japan wants to play, it will need to negotiate with China to some extent. So that is interesting that you see Japan kind of going in between. So who is the elephant in the room? Who have I not talked about? Здравствуйте, comrade. And we're going to go to Russia here. In order to cover Russia, what we're going to go is to a piece, ironically, from the Chinese in the South China Morning Post, which has done a lot of the coverage in this. And this will be the last piece for today. You're listening to CV Central. We are covering the world at war, even though they don't like to say it because it's impolite, and we don't want to offend anyone here. Lord knows this show is the most politically correct on iTunes while we're still here. Thank you for listening in. I am Tom Kaczynski, your host, as we go through the stories that are out there that may matter and help you understand a world that is breaking apart and see the different actors and plays that are out there. You make your own assessments. I don't tell you what to believe, not always anyway, and you wouldn't listen even if I did. But I do give you a lot of information that hopefully will prove useful in your better and ever-increasing understanding of this world. So let us go to the last piece that I have here, and this is how Donald Trump's efforts to readmit Russia to G7 could backfire and drive Moscow closer to Beijing. Keeping in mind that this isn't a Chinese paper, but I think it's really useful to see just how twisty these games are. And the idea that the U.S.-Russia alliance actually makes a ton of sense, makes sense if you look at things through a certain political lens. From my lens, it makes a ton of sense, but if you look at it from a different ideological lens, it's different. And this intersection between ideology and nationalism is actually one of the key ways we really do have to understand this, because if you don't understand it that way, you'll miss the fact that any of these breaking in different ways can shake alliances apart, and how we end up fighting, which is actually really important, really plays a big role, and it leads to surprising outcomes, which you see over and over again in history. All right, so U.S. President's olive branch was seen as an effort to drive a wedge between China and Russia, but observers say it may prove counterproductive. Vladimir Putin's 20-year rule has seen relations with China warm, and even the lure of seeing economic sanctions lifted may not be enough to reverse the trend. And let's add a little depth to this. We've reported that Russia needs to go ahead and sell oil. China is buying, right? And that the situation that Russia has, though, on the other hand of it, is they want to develop their economy, and that having a relationship with China is good. But China starts having a relationship with all these other countries around Russia, with Pakistan, with Iran, where they've had, different relationships over years. And into Europe, all of a sudden, Russia might start to feel surrounded by the dragon. And that ends up being a problem for the bear, because they don't have a lot of people. They have a pretty powerful military, but they don't really have the ability to exploit their resources. And who's left as a friend? Weird world, strange allies, right? But you can't even imagine this at this point. But if the U.S. and China get into conflict, it's always been the case that China and Russia sharing a border have always sort of seen the U.S. as a pivot against one another in ways. And it's very awkward for China and Russia to have a deep relationship because of the fact that Russia has a lot of resources, not a lot of people. China has a good amount of resources, but a lot of people and the ability to expand. That's a problem for the Russians. Let's see how it shakes out, though. Donald Trump's, and this piece, by the way, is by Xi Zhengtao from Hong Kong, published on June 6th, 10 a.m. Donald Trump's latest effort to readmit Russia to the Group of Seven is likely to tip the delicate balance between Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, but so far it has received a chilly response from traditional U.S. allies, and some diplomatic observers believe it may have the opposite effect to that intended. And it's kind of interesting, right? So let's talk about Germany for 1 second in this situation, because Germany's kind of the heart of the European economic motor. On the one hand, they go ahead and say that they want, they don't want to bring Russia in because they're worried about them not following economic norms in a lot of ways. On the other hand, they have that Cold Stream 2 pipeline where they get their natural gas from Russia, and they go ahead and work with them all the time. So every country is a hypocrite, every country is a liar, and the question of how Europe is working with China is at the heart of the Russian calculations. I guarantee you that's the truth. The U.S. president's olive branch was widely seen as an attempt to drive a wedge between China and Russia, but analysts warn that any realignment of that relationship between the three powers may only create more geopolitical uncertainty in the most post-coronavirus world. And I would say, if you get to a point where there is a right-wing nationalist America, Trump wins militarism, U.S. and Russia will prove allies in that world against Europe and China. Weird to imagine could happen. As the pandemic crisis deepens in the U.S., Trump desperately needs to deflect attention, especially in the face of an uphill battle for re-election, said Ma Zhengang, former Chinese ambassador to Britain. By turning to Russia, despite their acrimonious ties, the tapes aimed directly at China. There's little doubt the U.S. will be more focused on China, but it's still an open question if and how far Washington can achieve these goals, said Ma, former president for the China Institute of International Studies, a government-linked think tank in Beijing. Last Friday, Trump hit out at China's plans to impose a national security law in Hong Kong, threatening retaliation, and criticized Beijing's initial handling of the pandemic. The following day, he floated the idea of inviting Russia, along with Australia, South Korea, and India, to join a G7 summit in the U.S. later this year. It is the third year in a row that Trump has suggested Putin be allowed to rejoin the bloc of advanced countries. And he's had support historically from France and Italy as well. It's been interesting. We'll see if that changes. Russia was suspended from the G8 in 2014 following its invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. And, the thing about Crimea that's interesting is it was Russian. Ukraine was part of Russia longer than Texas has been part of America, so that's complicated there. I'm not saying that it wasn't shady, but these sort of things happen, countries expand their borders all the time. And America's certainly not absent that. We just control through proxy because it looks nicer. Expect the return of hard power to be part of the game because it's working. While Australia, South Korea, and India said they would accept Trump's offer for an expanded summit, the olive branch got the cold shoulder from Russia and was quickly rejected by the European Union, Canada, and Britain. China sees Russia's return to the G7 as an attempt to drive a wedge between Beijing and Moscow and form an anti-China alliance, said Xi Jinping, former Chinese diplomat in Russia and senior fellow at the Chinese International Studies in Beijing. It's a trial balloon to test the triangular relations between the three countries in a bid to score diplomatic points ahead of the presidential elections. And remember, COVID's at the heart of this question, because let's bring the virus back in here, because that's what we talk about on the show. If the virus gets really bad and you have 1 million people die in Russia and 10 million people die in America, and China is the one who's the fall boy for it, the public might demand and the leaders might follow the idea that China needs to be punished. So there's a really weird dynamic here where actually, and this is going to sound bizarre, but try to follow it. If the virus gets bad enough in the second wave we're predicting, where a whole bunch of people die, and let's say Russia, India, and the U.S., let's just build a square around China, right? Or at least a triangle. They might say, you know what, China did this. And once enough people have died and people feel mad enough, they might say, you know what, they do deserve to be punished. It's not much to propagandize your people and say China caused this. In fact, the evidence does suggest that it did escape the Wuhan laboratory, although it's important to mention that the National Institute of Health in the United States helped fund some of this research. And whether it was used all for security, like the suggestion has been made in some articles, to try to prevent a crisis from happening, or whether it was made by untoward actors to go ahead and facilitate it, or just a terrible accident that set off a chain reaction, ultimately, you could end up in a different place. So as you look at the struggles between these countries and the virus reshapes the narrative, look how aggressively China is working to reshape the narrative and being forced into highly aggressive actions that, frankly, don't fit what China was trying to do for the last so many years, but it was something that they had been talking about. It is a faction there, and that we need to look at this with a degree of depth and clarity that ultimately people get forced into choices lead to outcomes, and we're going to have to watch this. But let's bring COVID back in before we come back out, just so you can understand how that plays into this dynamic. Anyway, but frankly, it's quite risky for the embattled president to play the Russia card in times of domestic turmoil, she said. Other analysts argued there was no need to overstate the significance of Trump's offer. Beijing fully understands the need for Moscow to seek a reset in its relations with the U.S. and Western countries and breaking from its international isolation stemming from Crimea. Pan Dawei, specialist in Russian affairs at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, said. But considering the widespread wariness about Russia and Vladimir Putin, in particular among U.S. politicians, the intelligence community, and the public, and remember, so the deep state we've been seeing sort of leans against the sort of nationalist faction, right? So you have, let's be honest, Washington, D.C. is a left-leaning city, including the people who are in Washington, because they believe government should do more in self-interest. Conversely, the rural areas of the country look at it differently, and this is how all these pieces connect back together, and why these fights get exacerbated, and why you can't come together, because the natural interest of people, as well as the moral inclinations, are tearing America apart. What is happening in America in our civil war is a microcosm of the fight that's being enacted between countries, but interestingly, not within countries, right? Anyway, but it's unlikely that Trump, who is accused of having a soft spot for strongmen like Putin and President Xi Jinping, will be able to change attitudes. According to the Pew Research Center, while negative views of China among Americans have reached a historical high in March thanks to COVID and increasing trade and geopolitical tensions, American perceptions of Russia also hit a 10-year low in 2019, with only 18% having a positive view of the country. Vladimir Portyakov, deputy director of the Institute of Far Eastern Affairs at the Russian Academy of Scientists, also said Putin did not have any real reason to seriously consider attending the summit or change his current friendly stance towards China. Russia-China relations have been a success story during the last 2 decades under Putin's rule, especially when compared with Russia's relations with the bulk of other countries, he said. In 2018, Portyakov described China and Russia as reluctant allies who had long and bitter historical memories over past wars and territorial disputes and different global ambitions that caused deep-rooted distrust. But he argued pressure from the U.S. was likely to accelerate the China-Russia alignment. Now, Portyakov argues that Washington and Beijing's efforts to shift the blame for the devastating coronavirus crisis is another moment of reckoning for Moscow. From the very start, Russia found all the U.S. efforts to make Beijing a scapegoat for COVID absolutely counterproductive. And in a way, the U.S. pressure on China contributed to the strengthening of the Beijing-Moscow ties, said Portyakov. As a result, the triangle between the three powers would become less and less equilateral as Washington moved away from both Beijing and Moscow. Rising U.S.-China tensions are a godsend for Putin that both distracts Washington and provides an opportunity to seek concessions from both, according to Mark N. Katz, a professor of government and politics at George Mason University. In the economic realm, Moscow certainly does need Beijing more than Beijing needs Moscow, he said. Putin is unlikely to oppose China or join with the U.S. against it if there's a new Cold War between Washington and Beijing. On the other hand, Moscow will not want to link itself too closely with China against the U.S. either, but occupy a position somewhat between Washington and Beijing, albeit closer to the latter. But Katz challenged the prevailing views among Chinese and Russian scholars that Trump's offer to reinstate Russia in the G7 was meant to target China, and said his dislike of Barack Obama, who was president at the time of Russia's expulsion, was an important motivation. I really don't think that Trump sees it as part of being an anti-China move at all. If anything, it's more of an anti-Obama move, part of Trump's desire to undo everything Obama did. I also think Trump sees Putin as more of a kindred spirit than the other G7 leaders. And this is the problem of, it's interesting that they make that conclusion, and it may very well be true. This is the problem of the American hyperpower. When you have a single power, all the global conflicts end up being fought on our domestic front. So as the American people are divided against one another, it's because every other foreign power basically has to consider what the Americans are going to do in light of what they're going to do. So what do? They do everything they can to either A, get them to support their side or destabilize the country. So when you read reports about Russians destabilizing American politics, that's probably true. Although not to the extent that it's argued in the Washington Post and nearly not as effectively. Or if you read reports about the Chinese trying to destabilize American politics, as you will read in right-wing publications, that's probably true, but probably not to the extent you're thinking as well. What happens is that a fundamental conflict about the world, what the world's going to become, is being fought out in the hyperpower who could unilaterally, at least up until recently, impose that, is being fought out with these different actors who, in their national and ideological interests, are going forward. And all of these centrifugal forces are basically being used in a way to utterly tear the United States apart. And I don't think we have the ability to stop them because the United States are united no more. And so now we deal with a world where there are different players figuring out how they're going to act in the fallout from this as they watch America burn and our cities go nuts. And as you know, the COVID went ahead and made this impossible. COVID created the perfect storm by which we're going to see these pressures. So as you see the second wave come forward, and we will see it, and no matter how bad it is, and it may get worse, and I would expect, in fact, that if it doesn't get worse, interventions will be made virologically to ensure it does so, you're going to see America at war with itself in a lot of ways, and how bad that gets is anyone's guess, but I am not very optimistic about it. As we go forward and you look at the world reacting to that, look at how the world looks at the United States to understand that and understand what you want the United States to do in that world. The military would love to go to the world where our job is only to fight the enemies abroad, but the enemies abroad realize the way you win that war is to fight at home. And whether it's China's information security operations in Hong Kong or Russia involved in Crimea, efforts throughout wars by proxy in the Middle East, things the U.S. has done very, very well in other countries. As is historical irony, those wars often come home to roost, and now we deal with the same problems here on our home front. America went out into the world and it changed this country, and now the world is going to change us. Such things are only fair, and that's what happens in life. So these are the challenges we face, and as we go forward and we look at what's happening in the American example, and we ask for the questions of other actors, what's doing, remember that against that, unless we find a new center or some radical center we could agree upon that creates ourselves maybe something where we're self-contained and we get away from this to a multipolar world, ultimately America will not be able to survive. And do I think we're going to get there? No, I do not. And I think the smartest people understand that. They look beyond the narrow ideological concerns of protesters who, in America, for a very long time, there's a book about this that's good. You know, people always ask me what books to read. Go read the book Fantasyland. It's written from sort of a left-leaning perspective. Kurt Anderson, I think, is the name of the author. But it talks about how America lives in a world where we believe what we want to believe. And everyone does this, to be very clear. News is narrative told in different functions, but we assert as self-evident truths things that are not factually correct. When you live in fantasy, it costs a high level of mental stress to keep it together. America's defended a lot of fantasies for too long, and reality is knocking at the door. You better be ready for it. This show helps you get prepared. That's what I share with you on my better days. And hopefully today's episode proved helpful to you. So what I would say and what I am recommending to people to be aware of is that it's going to be a very long winter. You better be preparing. If you want to take some very good advice, think about your home heating solutions right now and your ability to provide for that beyond hitting a switch or having things there. If you don't have something on site, it might be a problem where you live. Sounds crazy. It won't be. And I do think whatever happens, those are legitimate fears. So let's bring it to a prayer, which I always do. And let me say this in preface to the prayer. Sometimes people ask me why I say prayers. I tell you why. I believe really what got America wrong. This is my personal opinion. You can agree or disagree. We don't believe in good and evil. We don't have a context to that. We believe it in a humanistic, relativistic sense that can be changed with whatever circumstances is. You know, there's a reason why, you know, faith endures over time, and that's because it posits the idea that there are universal goods and universal evils, and that if you are someone who finds yourself governed by them, whatever your political opinions, and my political opinions are very hard right in a lot of ways, but on the other hand, I remember that, you know, there are obligations to different people that we're called to do, at least as a Christian, I am in the Gospels, trumps that, because that's a good that's greater than humanity, and that we need something greater than ourselves if we're going to survive this. And by that, I don't mean the UN or institutions of man, you know, the diplomacy of dictators who will sell each other out in a heartbeat and who have done so 100 times before and expect as much, but I mean some higher calling we go to. So with that, I would say my prayer, Heavenly Father, we hope that you guide us to the greater truth that you promise, and that we may serve your bidding in this world rather than in our own, recognizing our own failures and frailties as human beings. And as we look around the world of people of all sorts, we see, despite the differences between us, the similarity and the loss that we've had, and in our own way to be corruptible, and hope that you would guide us to something better, and that quiet indwelling voice that still rests inside us for comfort, and that voice of Holy Spirit may speak to us all. So in Jesus' name I pray that guide us. And I'll just say that amen, so that we might avoid something really bad, because I don't think we're going to, but I mean, ultimately, whether we avoid it or don't avoid it, we're going to have to be aware that these structures are out there. And I will say, people acting with good intentions, with different views against one another, is actually how wars happen. So people write me a lot and say, Tom, don't you think these people have good intentions? I believe everyone in their intentions. I'm not questioning that. But if you have someone who has good intentions, who believes one set of beliefs, fighting a person with good intentions who has the total opposite of beliefs, that's where you reach the impasse where wars happen. And that's why, as much as people decry faith, the truth is the world of faith is one of fighting, and it's the one we always return to, because we can't help but believe and care. That's how we're built as people. God bless, keep safe. Tom Kaczynski for Coronavirus Central. I'll see you tonight on YouTube at 7 p.m., and then we'll see what the rest of the week brings. You guys keep safe out there.